You're watching the Everything Network. It was far more important in criminal history than the notorious Appalachian Conference in 1957. It was more significant than the Havana Convention of 1946. The 1929 Atlantic City Conference represented the first concrete move toward establishment of the National Crime Syndicate. It started out with screams and curses, but ended in the sweetness of reasonable accommodation, unanimously arrived at. This was demonstrated even by a relatively minute matter in which Al Capone agreed to go from the resort to Philadelphia, where he would be arrested on a gun charge and kept in jail. In the wake of the ruthless St. Valentine's Day massacre, which had outraged the entire nation, something had to be done to soothe the national temperament. It was agreed that Capone clapped in jail, even on a slap-on-the-wrist matter, would be good public relations. Capone saw the light. Even the Chicago savage was being tamed by the brains of the underworld. The Atlantic City Confab was hosted by Nucky Johnson, the boss of the city. He was able to guarantee there would be no police interference. However, some of the gangsters were subjected to a grievous affront. Johnson had registered them at the exclusive Break Hotel along the boardwalk, which was restricted to white Protestants, and he had used proper Anglo-Saxon aliases. Once the management got a look at Capone, Nig Rosen and others, the monikers didn't wash, and they were refused admittance. The hotel did not know with whom it was dealing, but the gangsters who had to keep their identities secret had to accept the ignominy of being drummed out of the place. By this time, Johnson had joined the group, and Capone screamed at him that he had failed to make the proper arrangements. A loud argument ensued, and the gangsters were afraid the pair would come to blows. Suddenly, Johnson, who was taller and heavier than Capone, shoved him into a limousine and ordered the others to join the caravan. The cars headed for the Ritz and its neighbor, the Ambassador Baroth. Still fuming, Capone ripped pictures from the wall of the quiet Ritz lobby and heaved them at Johnson. As Lucky Luciano recalled, everybody got over being mad and concentrated on keeping Al quiet. That's the way our convention started. Amazingly, it went on to become a huge success. Deals were struck involving a wide disparity of interests and criminals of varied backgrounds. Among the delegates present were Greasy Thumb Guzik, in addition to Capone from Chicago, Nig Rosen and Boo Boo Hoff of Philadelphia, King Solomon of Boston, Abe Bernstein of the Purple Gang from Detroit, Mo Dalitz and Chuck Polizzi of Cleveland, Longy Zwillman of New Jersey, John Lazia, representing Tom Pendergast of Kansas City, Daniel Walsh of Providence, Rhode Island. New York offered the biggest contingent, including Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Johnny Torrio, with whom Capone had an emotional reunion, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Dutch Schultz, Louis Lepke, Vince Mangano, Gambler Frank Erickson, Frank Scalise, and Albert Anastasia. Equally important were the two men who weren't there, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, two old-line mafiosi ready to square off in New York in a war to claim the position of boss of bosses. Their obsession with such a claim ran counter to the desires of the Atlantic City conferees, who were looking for a confederation of forces that left each supreme in his own area. Above all, the conferees understood the need for working with all ethnics. In fact, almost half of them were Jewish. In terms of the power they represented, they probably composed a more potent force than the Italians. In reality, the conference was the creation of two men of like thoughts, Meyer Lansky and Johnny Torrio, both of whom saw the virtue of establishing a syndicate of cooperation. Plans were laid at the meeting for activities after Prohibition. It was agreed that the gangs would get into the legitimate end of the liquor business by acquiring distilleries, breweries, and important franchises. It was agreed there was a big future in gambling, and the country was divided into exclusive franchises for both the liquor and gambling campaigns. Emphasis was laid on the fact that all these activities had to be apportioned peacefully to avoid the sort of gang wars that would inevitably lead to governmental crackdowns. The successful 7 group that resolved the bootlegging wars was held up as the way of the future. This, it was agreed, did not mean force would not have to be used to achieve this end. All the conferees understood that the Luciano Lansky forces would have to employ considerable violence to get rid of the old-line mafiosi. No one at the time articulated the idea, but the conference had agreed to kill off the Italian Mafia and replace it with an American Mafia, one that functioned within an all-ethnic combination. Capone certainly understood he had to rid Chicago once and for all of Mafia kingpin Joey Aiello. That task was accomplished the following year. Overall, both Torrio and Lansky had hoped the conference would go even further in establishing the crime syndicate, but overall they were satisfied with the results. It had been a conference that started out badly and still managed to end with Capone and Johnson embracing one another. Never before had so much been accomplished by such a group of important criminals, and it had been done in most unorthodox manner. Many decisions were taken as the leading criminals in America walked barefoot through the water, their pants' legs rolled up. In such fashion, empires were carved out and decisions made on who would live and who would die. You're watching the Everything Network. Dutch Schultz was an American mobster based in New York City in the 1920s and 1930s. Schultz made his fortune in organized crime-related activities, including bootlegging and the numbers racket. Schultz's rackets were weakened by 2 tax evasion trials led by prosecutor Thomas Dewey, and also threatened by fellow mobster Lucky Luciano. Schultz asked the commission for permission to kill Dewey in an attempt to avert his conviction, which they refused. When Schultz disobeyed them and made an attempt to kill Dewey, the commission ordered his murder in 1935. Arthur Simon Fliegenheimer was born on August 6, 1901, to German Jewish immigrants Hermann and Emma Neu Fliegenheimer, who had married in Manhattan on November 10, 1900. He had a younger sister, Helen, born in 1904. Hermann Fliegenheimer apparently abandoned his family, and Emma is listed as divorced in the 1910 US Census. In her 1932 petition for US citizenship, however, she wrote that her husband had died in 1910, though it is unclear whether he died before or after the 1910 US Census. The event traumatized young Fliegenheimer, who spent the rest of his life denying that his father had abandoned his family. Fliegenheimer dropped out of school in the 8th grade to help support himself and his mother. He worked as a feeder and pressman for the Clark Loose Leaf Company, Caxton Press, American Express, and Schultz Trucking in the Bronx between 1916 and 1919. Before turning to burglary, Fliegenheimer worked at a neighborhood nightclub owned by a small-time mobster where he robbed craps games. Eventually, he was caught breaking into an apartment and sent to the prison on Blackwell's Island, now called Roosevelt Island. Fliegenheimer's mugshot, aged 18, was published in the 2010 book New York City Gangland. He proved to be such an unmanageable prisoner that he was transferred to a work farm in West Hampton, Long Island. After he was recaptured following an escape, he had 2 months added to his sentence. Fliegenheimer was released on parole on December 8, 1920, and went back to work at Schultz Trucking. With the enactment of the Volstead Act and the start of prohibition in the United States, the shipping company began smuggling liquor and beer into New York City from Canada. This led Fliegenheimer to start associating with known criminals. It was also during this time that Flegenheimer became better known as Dutch Schultz. Following a disagreement, he left Schultz Trucking and went to work for their Italian competitors. In the mid-1920s, Schultz had begun work as a bouncer at the Hub Social Club, a small speakeasy in the Bronx, owned by a gangster named Joey No. No was impressed with Schultz's ruthlessness and reputation for brutality when he lost his temper, and he made him a partner. Together, they soon opened more illegal drinking joints around the Bronx. Using their own trucks to reduce high delivery costs, they brought in beer made by Frankie Dunn, a brewer in Union City, New Jersey. Schultz often rode shotgun to guard the trucks from hijackers. Schultz and No soon had to deal with the brothers John and Joe Rock, who were already running a bootlegging operation in the Bronx. Initially, the brothers refused to buy beer from No and Schultz, but eventually John, the elder brother, agreed to cooperate. However, his younger brother Joe refused. One night, the No Schultz gang kidnapped Joe, beat him, and hung him by his thumbs from a meat hook. They then allegedly wrapped a gauze bandage smeared with discharge from a gonorrhea infection over his eyes. His family reportedly paid $35,000 for his release. Shortly after his return, he went blind. From then on, the No Schultz gang met little opposition as they expanded across the entire Bronx. Bootlegging during Prohibition made Schultz very wealthy. The No Schultz operation, which had begun to flourish in the Bronx, soon became the only gang able to rival the network of Italian crime syndicates that became the Mafia's 5 families. When the gang expanded from the Bronx over to Manhattan's Upper West Side and the neighborhoods of Washington Heights, Yorkville, and Harlem, they moved their headquarters to East 149th Street in the Bronx. However, this brazen move led to a bootleg war with New York's Irish mob, led by Jack "Legs" Diamond. In the early hours of October 16, 1928, No was shot several times outside the Chateau Madrid, a speakeasy at 231 West 54th. Although seriously wounded, he managed to return fire. A blue Cadillac was seen hitting some parked cars and losing one of its doors before speeding away. When police found the car an hour later, they discovered the body of a Louis Weinberg, no relation to Schultz gang members Abraham Bo Weinberg and George Weinberg, in the back seat. No's wounds became infected, and he died on November 21st. Schultz was left angry and distraught by the loss of his friend and mentor. Retaliation started a few weeks later when Arnold Rothstein, a kingpin in the Jewish mob, was found fatally shot near the service entrance to the Park Central Hotel on November 6, 1928. Although George "Hump" McManus supposedly killed Rothstein over a bad gambling debt, Schultz is believed to have ordered the killing in retribution for No's death. This theory is supported by the fact that the first person McManus rang after the killing was Schultz's attorney, Dixie Davis. Schultz's trusted lieutenant, Bo Weinberg, then picked up McManus and drove him away from the murder scene. McManus was later cleared of the killing. On October 12, 1930, Legs Diamond was shot and wounded at the Hotel Monticello on Manhattan's West Side. 2 gunmen forced their way into his room and shot him 5 times before fleeing. Still in his pajamas, he staggered into the hallway and collapsed. When asked later by the New York Police Commissioner how he managed to walk out of the room, Diamond said he drank 2 shots of whiskey first. Diamond was rushed to the Polyclinic Hospital in Manhattan, where he eventually recovered. On December 30, 1930, he was discharged from Polyclinic. During his absence, his gang was forced to leave the city. When he returned home, Legs Diamond began carving out a new territory for himself in Albany. Jack Diamond first started his underworld career in Manhattan with a street gang called the Hudson Dusters. His first arrest for burglary occurred when he broke into a jewelry store on February 4, 1914. Diamond served in the United States Army in World War I, but was convicted and jailed for desertion in 1918. After being released in 1921, he became hired muscle and later a personal bodyguard for Arnold Rothstein. Diamond was known for leading a rather flamboyant lifestyle. He was an energetic individual. His nickname, Legs, derived either from his being a good dancer or from how fast he could escape his enemies. His wife Alice was never supportive of his life of crime, but did not do much to dissuade him from it. Diamond was a womanizer. His best-known mistress was showgirl and dancer Marion Kiki Roberts. Following the death of Jacob, Little Augie Orgen, Diamond oversaw illegal alcohol sales in downtown Manhattan via the Hotsy Totsy Club, an establishment partly owned by Diamond on Broadway. This work brought him into conflict with Dutch Schultz, who wanted to move beyond his base in Harlem. He also ran into trouble with other gangs in the city. On July 14, 1929, Diamond and fellow gang member Charles Entrata shot 3 drunken brawlers in the Hotsy Totsy Club. 2 of the brawlers, William Cassidy and Simon Walker, were killed, while the survivor, Peter Cassidy, was severely wounded. The club's bartender, 3 waiters, and the hat check girl vanished. One of them was found shot dead in New Jersey. Diamond was not charged, but he was forced to close the club. In 1930, Diamond and 2 henchmen kidnapped truck driver Grover Parks in Cairo, New York, demanding to know where he had obtained his load of hard cider. When Parks denied carrying anything, Diamond and his men beat and tortured Parks, eventually letting him go. A few months later, Diamond was charged with the kidnapping of James Duncan. He was sent to Catskill, New York, for his first trial, but he was acquitted. However, he was convicted in a federal case on related charges and sentenced to 4 years in jail. Diamond was tried in December 1931 in Troy, New York, also for kidnapping. He was once again acquitted. On October 24, 1924, Diamond was shot and wounded by shotgun pellets, reportedly after trying to hijack liquor trucks belonging to a rival crime family. On October 16, 1927, Diamond tried to stop the murder of Little Augie Orgen. Jack's brother Eddie was Augie's bodyguard, but Diamond substituted for Eddie that day. As Augie and Jack were walking down a street on Manhattan's Lower East Side, 3 young men approached them and started shooting. Augie was fatally wounded, and Diamond was shot twice below the heart. Diamond was taken to Bellevue Hospital, where he eventually recovered. Police interviewed Diamond in the hospital, but he refused to identify any suspects or help the investigation in any way. Police initially suspected that Diamond was an accomplice and charged him with homicide, but the charge was dropped. The assailants were supposedly hired by Louise Buckhalter and Gura Shapiro, who were seeking to encroach on Orgen's garment district labor rackets. On April 21, 1931, Diamond was arrested in Catskill on assault charges for the Parks beating in 1930. 2 days later, he was released from the county jail on $25,000 bond. 5 days later, Diamond was again shot and wounded at the Aratoga Inn, a roadhouse near Cairo. After eating in the dining room with 3 companions, Diamond was shot 3 times and collapsed by the front door. A local resident drove Diamond to a hospital in Albany, where he eventually recovered. On May 1st, while Diamond was still in the hospital, the New York State Police seized over $5,000 worth of illegal beer and alcohol from his hiding places in Cairo and at the Aratoga Inn. In August 1931, Diamond and Paul Quattrocchi went on trial for bootlegging. The same month, Diamond was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Schultz also had to deal with internecine conflicts within his own gang. In 1930, one of Schultz's enforcers, Vincent Cole, demanded to be made an equal partner. This was because Schultz gang members received a flat salary instead of the customary percentage from the take, a unique arrangement compared to other major gangs in organized crime. When Schultz refused, Cole formed his own crew with the ultimate goal of murdering Schultz and taking over his territory. Cole's ruthlessness made him a valued enforcer to Schultz at first. As Schultz's criminal empire grew in power during the 1920s, he employed Cole as an assassin. At age 19, Cole was charged with the murder of Anthony Borello, the owner of a speakeasy, and Mary Smith, a dance hall hostess. Cole allegedly murdered Borello because he refused to sell Schultz's bootleg alcohol. The charges were eventually dismissed, and many suspect this to have been due to Schultz's influence. Schultz was not happy about Cole's actions. In 1929, without Schultz's permission, Cole robbed a dairy in the Bronx of $17,000. He and his gang posed as armed guards to gain access to the cashier's room. Schultz later confronted Cole about the robbery, but rather than being apologetic, Cole demanded to be an equal partner. Schultz declined. By January 1930, Cole had formed his own gang and was engaged in a shooting war with Schultz. One of the earliest victims was Peter Cole, Vincent's older brother, who was shot dead on May 30th, 1931, while driving down a Harlem street. Cole subsequently went into a rage of grief and vengeance. Over the next 3 weeks, he gunned down 4 of Schultz's men. In all, around 20 men were killed in the bloodletting. The exact figure is hard to pin down. New York was also in the midst of the vicious Castellammarese War at the same time. It was mayhem on the streets of Manhattan, and the police often had difficulty in deciding which corpse belonged to which war. On June 2nd, Cole and his gang broke into a garage owned by Schultz and destroyed 120 vending machines and 10 trucks. As the war continued, Vincent Cole and his gang killed approximately 20 of Schultz's men. To finance his new gang, Cole kidnapped rival gangsters and held them for ransom. He knew that the victims would not report the kidnappings to police. They would have a hard time explaining to the Bureau of Internal Revenue why the ransom cash had not been reported as income. One of Cole's best-known victims was gambler George Big Frenchy Demange, a close associate of Oni Madden, boss of the Hell's Kitchen Irish mob. According to one account, Cole telephoned Demange and asked to meet with him. When Demange arrived at the meeting place, Cole kidnapped him at gunpoint. He released Demange 18 hours later after receiving a ransom payment. In July 28, 1931, Cole allegedly participated in a kidnapping attempt that resulted in the shooting death of a child. Cole's target was bootlegger Joseph Rao, a Schultz underling who was lounging in front of a social club. Several children were playing outside an apartment house. A large touring car pulled up to the curb, and several men pointed shotguns and submachine guns towards Rao and started shooting. Rao threw himself to the sidewalk, and 4 young children were wounded in the attack. One of them, 5-year-old Michael Vengali, later died at Beth David Hospital. After the Vengali killing, New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker dubbed Cole a "Mad Dog." On October 4, 1931, after an extensive manhunt, New York police arrested Cole at a hotel in the Bronx. He had dyed his hair black and grown a mustache and was wearing horn-rimmed glasses. He surrendered peacefully. During a police lineup, a defiant Cole said that he had been in Albany, New York, for the past several months and refused to answer any other questions without an attorney present. On October 5th, a grand jury in New York City indicted Cole for the Vengali murder. The Cole trial began in December 1931. He retained famed defense lawyer Samuel Leibowitz. Cole claimed that he was miles away from the shooting scene and was being framed by his enemies. He added that he would love to tear the throat out of the person who killed Vengali. The prosecution case soon fell apart. Their sole witness to the shooting, George Brecht, admitted on the witness stand to having a criminal and mental health record and to making similar testimony in a previous murder case in St. Louis, Missouri. At the end of December, the judge issued a directed verdict of not guilty for Cole. Immediately after the Vengali verdict, a New York City police inspector told Cole that the police would arrest him whenever he was spotted in New York City. He was soon re-jailed for carrying a gun. When the inspector referred to Cole as a baby killer, Cole hotly replied, "I'm no baby killer." Soon after his acquittal, Cole married Lottie Kreisberger, a fashion designer in New York. In September 1931, between the killing of young Vengali and his acquittal for that death, Cole was hired by Salvatore Maranzano, who had recently declared himself capo di tutti capi, to murder Charles Lucky Luciano, the new acting boss of the Mafia family of the same name. Tommy Lucchese alerted Luciano that he was marked for death. Months earlier, Luciano had ended the Castellamarese War by ordering the assassination of his own boss, Joseph Masseria, which left Maranzano as the most powerful boss in the five families. Maranzano soon decided, however, that Luciano was a threat. On September 10th, Maranzano summoned Luciano, Vito Genovese and Frank Costello to his office at the 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. Certain that Maranzano planned to murder them, Luciano decided to act first. He sent 4 Jewish hitmen whose faces were unknown to Maranzano and his enforcers. They had been secured with the aid of Luciano's close associates, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Disguised as government agents, 2 of the gangsters disarmed Maranzano's bodyguards. The other 2, aided by Lucchese, who went along to point Maranzano out, stabbed the Sicilian boss multiple times and then finished him off by shooting him. According to the 1963 testimony of government witness Joseph Valachi, Maranzano had paid Cole $25,000 for all 3 murders in advance. But when Cole arrived at Maranzano's office that same day intending to kill Luciano, Genovese, and Costello, he found Lucchese and the 4 Jewish hitmen fleeing the scene. After learning from them that Maranzano was dead, Cole left the building. Both Dutch Schultz and Oni Madden had put a $50,000 bounty on Vincent Cole's head. At one point, Schultz had actually walked into a Bronx police station and offered a house in Westchester to whoever killed Cole. On February 1st, 1932, 4 or 5 gunmen invaded a Bronx apartment which Cole was rumored to frequent and opened fire with pistols and submachine guns. 3 people, Cole gangsters Patsy Del Greco and Fiorio Basile and bystander Emily Tanzillo, were killed. 3 others were wounded. Cole himself did not show up until 30 minutes after the shooting. A week after the Bronx shootings, at 12:30 a.m. on February 8th, Cole was using a phone booth at a drugstore at 8th Avenue and 23rd Street in Manhattan. He was reportedly talking to Madden, demanding $50,000 from the gangster under the threat of kidnapping his brother-in-law. Madden kept Cole on the line while it was traced. 3 men in a dark limousine soon arrived at the drugstore. While one waited in the car, 2 others stepped out. One man waited outside while the other walked inside the store. The gunman told the cashier, "Keep cool, now," drew a Thompson submachine gun from under his overcoat and opened fire on Cole in the glass phone booth. Cole died instantly. The killers took off in their car. They were chased unsuccessfully up 8th Avenue by a foot patrolman who had heard the gunshots and commandeered a passing taxi, but the car got away. A total of 15 bullets were removed from Cole's body at the morgue. More may have passed through him. The killers may have included Edward Fats McCarthy and the brothers Bo and George Weinberg. With the end of Prohibition, Dutch Schultz needed to find new sources of income. His answer came with Otto Abba Dabba Berman and the Harlem Numbers Racket. The Numbers Racket, the forerunner of Pick 3 lotteries, required players to choose 3 numbers, which were then derived from the last number before the decimal in the handle, total amount bet, taken daily at Belmont Park. Berman was a middle-aged accountant and math whiz who helped Schultz fix this racket. In a matter of seconds, Berman could mentally calculate the minimum amount of money Schultz needed to bet at the track to alter the odds at the last minute. This strategy ensured that Schultz always controlled which numbers won, guaranteeing a larger number of losers in Harlem and a multi-million-dollar-a-month tax-free income for Schultz. Berman was reportedly paid $10,000 a week, equivalent to $182,000 in 2023. Along with the policy rackets, Schultz began extorting New York restaurant owners and workers. Schultz, working through a hulking gangster named Jules Modulowski, also known as Julie Martin, made deals with the leaders of Waiters Local 16 and Cafeteria Workers Local 302 to extort money by forcing restaurant owners to join the Metropolitan Restaurant and Cafeteria Owners Association, an employer association that Schultz had founded. Those who refused to join the association were faced with exorbitant wage demands from the unions, followed by strikes and stink bomb attacks. The Metropolitan Association then stepped in to arrange a settlement of the strike with a sweetheart contract for low wages, contingent on the employer joining the association. Martin Modulowski successfully extracted thousands of dollars of tributes and dues from the terrorized restaurant owners for Schultz. During Schultz's tax trial, he began to suspect that Martin was skimming from the shakedown operation. He had recently discovered a $70,000 disparity in the books. On the evening of March 2nd, 1935, he invited Martin to a meeting at the Harmony Hotel in Cohoes, New York. At the meeting, at which Chief Enforcer Bo Weinberg and mob lawyer Dixie Davis were also present, Martin belligerently denied Schultz's charges and began arguing with him. Both men were drinking heavily as the argument continued, and Schultz sucker-punched Martin. Finally, Martin admitted that he had taken $20,000, which he believed he was entitled to anyway. Dixie Davis related what happened next. Dutch Schultz was ugly. He had been drinking, and suddenly he had his gun out. He wore his pistol under his vest, tucked inside his pants, right against his belly. One jerk at his vest, and he had it in his hand. All in the same quick motion, he swung it up, stuck it in Jules Martin's mouth, and pulled the trigger. It was as simple and undramatic as that, just one quick motion of the hand. Dutch Schultz did that murder just as casually, as if he were picking his teeth. As Martin contorted on the floor, Schultz apologized to Davis for killing someone in front of him. When Davis later read a newspaper story about Martin's murder, he was shocked to find out that the body was found on a snowbank with a dozen stab wounds to the chest. When Davis asked about this, Schultz replied, deadpan, "I cut his heart out." As his defense costs to fight his tax case mounted, Schultz had found it necessary to reduce the commission he paid to those running his policy rackets to bolster what he called the Arthur Flegenheimer Defense Fund. That tactic angered the runners and the game's controllers, who, despite being threatened with violence for showing any dissent, hired a hall, held a mass protest meeting, and declared a strike of sorts. Very quickly, the cash flow dried up, and Schultz was forced to back down, which permanently damaged the relationship between his gang and their associates. Bo Weinberg, Schultz's chief lieutenant, was so concerned about the amount of money that Schultz was taking from the rackets to fund his legal defense that he sought advice from New Jersey mob boss Longy Zwillman, who put him in touch with the Sicilian-born gangster Charlie Lucky Luciano. The deal that Weinberg wanted was to retain a percentage and keep overall control of the Schultz gang. However, Luciano planned to break up the gang's rackets and territory among his own associates once Schultz was convicted of tax evasion. Believing that a guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion at the second trial, Luciano and his allies implemented their plan to take control. Their plan met little resistance because of the ongoing bad feelings over the attempted pay cuts and the support of Weinberg. However, after Schultz was acquitted, he quickly arranged a meeting with Luciano through the commission to clarify the situation. Luciano explained to Schultz that they were just looking after the shop while he was away to ensure that everything ran smoothly and that full control of his rackets would be returned to Schultz once the heat died down. Publicly, Schultz was forced to accept that version of events because of the ongoing attention from law enforcement agencies and Thomas Dewey, now a special prosecutor appointed by LaGuardia. A month after his acquittal, his own chief lieutenant Bo Weinberg was never seen again after he had walked out of a midtown Manhattan nightclub. Schultz had proposed to the National Crime Syndicate, a confederation of mobsters, that Dewey be murdered. Luciano argued that a Dewey assassination would precipitate a massive law enforcement crackdown. The commission later voted unanimously against the proposal. An enraged Schultz said he would kill Dewey anyway and walked out of the meeting. The Murder Inc. leader Albert Anastasia approached Luciano with information that Schultz had asked him to stake out Dewey's apartment building on Fifth Avenue. Upon hearing the news, the commission held a discreet meeting to discuss the matter. After 6 hours of deliberations, the commission ordered Louis Buchalter to eliminate the Dutchman. The Dutchman was shot on October 23, 1935, at the Palace Chop House restaurant at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey, with Otto Berman, his accountant, Abraham Abe Landau, his new chief lieutenant, and his personal bodyguard, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz. While Schultz was in the men's room, 2 Murder Inc. hitmen named Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss entered the establishment. Workman walked the length of the bar and opened the door to the men's room, where he encountered Schultz. Workman shot Schultz, who dropped to the floor. Workman then entered the back dining room with Weiss. Both men fired numerous times at the Schultz gang members. Berman collapsed immediately after he was shot. Landau's carotid artery was severed by a bullet passing through his neck, and Rosenkrantz was hit repeatedly at point-blank range. Despite their injuries, both gangsters rose to their feet, returned fire, and drove the assassins out of the restaurant. Weiss jumped into the getaway car and ordered the driver to abandon Workman. Landau chased Workman out of the bar and emptied his pistol at him, but missed. After Workman had fled on foot, Landau collapsed onto a nearby trash can. Witnesses say Schultz staggered out of the bathroom, clutching his side, and sat at his table. He called for anyone who could hear him to get an ambulance. Rosenkrantz rose to his feet and demanded that the barman, who had hidden during the shootout, give him some change. Rosenkrantz called for an ambulance before he lost consciousness. When the first ambulance arrived, medics determined Landau and Rosenkrantz were the most seriously wounded and needed to be taken immediately to Newark City Hospital. A second ambulance was called to take Schultz and Berman. Berman was unconscious, but Schultz was drifting in and out of lucidity as police attempted to comfort him and get information. Because the medics had no pain relievers, Schultz was given brandy to relieve his suffering. When a second ambulance arrived from Newark City Hospital, Schultz gave an intern in the ambulance $3,000 in cash because he thought he was dying, and said that it was not going to do him any good where he was going. After surgery, when it looked as if Schultz might live, the intern was so worried that Schultz would come back for his cash that he handed in the money. Landau and Rosenkrantz refused to say anything to the police until Schultz had given them permission after he had arrived in the second ambulance. Even then, they provided the police with only minimal information. At 2:20 a.m., Otto Bermann, the oldest and least physically fit of the four men, was the first to die. Abe Landau died of blood loss at 6 a.m. When Rosenkrantz was taken into surgery, the surgeons were so incredulous that Rosenkrantz was still alive despite his blood loss and ballistic trauma that they were unsure of how to treat him. He eventually died from his injuries 29 hours after the shooting. Schultz received the last rites from a Catholic priest at his request just before he went into surgery. He reportedly believed Jesus enabled him to beat an indictment and had promised to convert. He lingered for almost 1 day, speaking in various states of lucidity with his wife, mother, a priest, police, and hospital staff, before he died of peritonitis on October 24, 1935. Schultz was permitted interment in the Roman Catholic Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, Westchester County, New York. But at the request of his Orthodox Jewish mother, Schultz's body was draped with a talit, a traditional Jewish prayer shawl. In 1941, Charles Workman was convicted of killing Schultz and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was paroled in 1964. The building that housed the Palace Chop House was torn down in 2008. It was said that before 1920, organized crime, in its truest sense, did not exist in this country. We had huge, organized gangs of criminals, but crime itself was not organized. It did not embrace the vast interplay of a network of gangs with certain territorial rights, but an obligation to handle matters within their territory for other gangs, up to and including murders. Such rules, discussed in detail in the Mafia entry, were not restricted, in the new picture, to the Italian criminal gangs. For example, the Jewish Purple Mob in Detroit handled assignments in its area for the Capone mob, and if it needed certain chores taken care of in Cleveland, it could rely on the Jewish mobsters under Mo Dalitz or his Mafia allies in the Mayfield Road mob. After 1920, in a stunning development, the ethnic criminals of the day, the Italians and Jews, as it happens, the successors to the Irish in the criminal breeding grounds of the ghettos, were catapulted to new heights of power, accumulating such great wealth that they were no longer the lackeys of the political bosses and their police puppets, but rather the new masters. Indeed, Prohibition created something very new in history: the millionaire criminal, the beneficiary of bootlegging. By the early 1930s, a purge within organized crime had eliminated the less foresighted among the vastly enriched criminal leaders. The two most important criminals of the day, Lucky Luciano, Sicilian-born, and Meyer Lansky, a Polish-born Jew, but both Americans to the core, successfully unified the great criminal gangs into a vast national crime syndicate. It was they who set up a board of directors of organized crime, who apportioned territories and rights and duties among the gangs, and who even set up an enforcement arm that was to become known as Murder Incorporated. Still, the end of Prohibition could have spelled the end to organized crime in America, but for the Depression and the law, or frequent lack in enforcement thereof. The syndicate had become so rich it could suffer through some lean Depression years as it moved into other rackets. But perhaps more important, the economic climate itself helped the organization achieve stability. With repeal, the Italians and Jews should have reverted to their prior condition as ethnics about to step out from the ghettos, but the Great Depression froze these groups in place. Those talented in the entertainment and sports worlds, and a few through better education, could avoid the realities of a battered economic system. Most youths were trapped in the ghettos, and for them, the only avenue of escape was crime. Thus, organized crime had a steady supply of new recruits from its own ethnic ranks. This allowed organized crime to further sophisticate its own appreciation and understanding of crime. The wisecracking, loud-dressing, obscene and violent criminals of the 1920s did not disappear, but more and more became the followers of more intelligent criminal leaders. Meyer Lansky saw the potentials in new rackets. Luciano had a superb ability to activate such plans. And Frank Costello, Longis Willman, and others knew how to corrupt a political system to achieve substantial non-interference by the law. Ironically, some elements of the law itself cooperated remarkably, without prompting and without bribery. You're watching the Everything Network. The French Connection was a line through which heroin was smuggled from Indochina, through Turkey, to France, and then to the United States and Canada. The operation started in the 1930s, reached its peak in the 1960s, and was dismantled in the 1970s. It was responsible for providing the vast majority of the heroin used in the United States at the time. The operation was headed by Corsicans Antoine Guérini and Paul Carbone, with associate François Spirito. It also involved Auguste Ricord, Paul Mondoloni, and Salvatore Greco. Illegal heroin labs were first discovered near Marseille, France, in 1937. These labs were run by Corsican gang leader Paul Carbone. For years, the Corsican underworld had been involved in the manufacturing and trafficking of heroin, primarily to the United States. It was this heroin network that eventually became known as the French Connection. The Corsican gang was protected by the Central Intelligence Agency and the SDECE after World War II, in exchange for working to prevent French communists from bringing the old port of Marseille under their control. Historically, the raw material for most of the heroin consumed in the United States came from Indochina, then Turkey. Turkish farmers were licensed to grow opium poppies for sale to legal drug companies, but many sold their excess to the underworld market, where it was manufactured into heroin and transported to the United States. The morphine paste was refined in Corsican laboratories in Marseille, one of the busiest ports in the western Mediterranean Sea, known for shipping all types of illegal goods. The Marseille heroin was considered high quality. The convenience of the port at Marseille and the frequent arrival of ships from opium-producing countries made it easy to smuggle the morphine base to Marseille from the Far East or the Near East. The French underground would then ship large quantities of heroin from Marseille to New York City. The first significant post-World War II seizure was made in New York on February 5, 1947, when 7 pounds 3 kilograms of heroin was seized from a Corsican sailor disembarking from a vessel that had just arrived from France. It soon became clear that the French underground was increasing not only its participation in the illegal trade of opium, but also its expertise and efficiency in heroin trafficking. On March 17, 1947, 28 pounds of heroin were found on the French liner Saint-Tropez. On January 7, 1949, more than 50 pounds of opium and heroin were seized on the French ship Batista. After Paul Carbone's death, the Guérini clan was the ruling dynasty of the Union Corse and had systematically organized the smuggling of opium from Turkey and other Middle Eastern countries. The Guérini clan was led by Marseille mob boss Antoine Guérini and his brothers, Barthélemy, François, and Pascal. A meeting between Sicilian Mafia and American Mafia members in the fall of 1957 was held at the Grand Hotel Et des Palmes in Palermo, to discuss the international illegal heroin trade in the French Connection. The first major French Connection seizure in the 1960s began in June, when an informant told a drug agent in Lebanon that Mauricio Rosell, the Guatemalan ambassador to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, was smuggling morphine base from Beirut to Marseille. Narcotics agents had been seizing about 200 pounds of heroin in a typical year, but intelligence showed that the Corsican traffickers were smuggling in 200 pounds every other week. Rosell alone, in 1 year, had used his diplomatic status to bring in about 440 pounds. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics' 1960 annual report estimated that from 2,600 to 5,000 pounds, 1,200 to 2,300 kilograms of heroin were coming into the United States annually from France. The French traffickers continued to exploit the demand for their illegal product, and by 1969, they were supplying the United States with 80% of its heroin. On April 26, 1968, a record-setting seizure was made. 246 pounds of heroin smuggled to New York, concealed in a Citroën DS on the SS France 1960 ocean liner. The total amount smuggled during the many transatlantic voyages of just this one car was 1,606 pounds, according to arrested smuggler Jacques Bousquet. In an effort to limit the most proximate source of supply to the Corsican cartel, US officials went to Turkey to negotiate the phasing out of opium production. Initially, the Turkish government agreed to limit their opium production, starting with the 1968 crop. At the end of the 1960s, after Robert Blement's assassination by Antoine Guérini, a gang war started in Marseille, caused by competition over casino revenues. Blement's associate Marcel Francisci continued the war over the next years. Former New York City Police Department Narcotics Bureau Detective Sonny Grosso has stated that the kingpin of the French Connection heroin ring during the 1950s into the 1960s was Corsican Jean Jahan. Although Jahan is reported to have arranged the famous 1962 deal gone wrong of 64 pounds of pure heroin, he was never arrested for his involvement in international heroin smuggling. According to Grosso, all warrants for the arrest of Jahan were left open. For years thereafter, he was reported to be seen arranging and operating drug activities at will throughout Europe. According to William Friedkin, director of the 1971 film The French Connection, Jahan had been a member of the French resistance to Nazi occupation during World War II, and because of that, French law enforcement officials refused to arrest him. Friedkin was told that Jahan died peacefully of old age at his home in Corsica. Following 5 subsequent years of concessions, combined with international cooperation, the Turkish government finally agreed in 1971 to a complete ban on the growing of Turkish poppies for the production of opium, effective June 29, 1971. During these protracted negotiations, law enforcement personnel went into action. One of the major roundups began on January 4, 1972, when agents from the US Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs and French authorities seized 110 pounds of heroin at the Paris airport. Subsequently, traffickers Jean-Baptiste and Joseph Marie were arrested in Marseille. One such French seizure from the French Connection in 1973 netted 210 pounds of heroin worth $38 million. In February 1972, French traffickers offered a United States Army sergeant $96,000, equivalent to $699,000 in 2023, to smuggle 240 pounds, 109 kilograms of heroin into the United States. He informed his superior, who in turn notified the BNDD. As a result of this investigation, 5 men in New York and 2 in Paris were arrested with 264 pounds, 120 kilograms of heroin, which had a street value of $50 million. In a 14-month period, starting in February 1972, 6 major illicit heroin laboratories were seized and dismantled in the suburbs of Marseille by French National Narcotics Police in collaboration with agents from the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. On February 29, 1972, French authorities seized the shrimp boat Caprice de Thème as it put to sea near Marseille, heading towards Miami. It was carrying 915 pounds, 415 kilos of heroin. Drug arrests in France skyrocketed from 57 in 1970 to 3,016 in 1972. Also broken up as part of this investigation was the crew of American Mafia Lucchese family mobster Vincent Papa, whose members included Anthony Lauria Sr. and Virgil Alessi. The well-organized gang was responsible for distributing close to $1 million worth of heroin up and down the east coast of the United States during the early 1970s, which in turn led to a major New York Police Department corruption scheme. The scope and depth of this scheme are still not known, but officials suspect it involved corrupt NYPD officers who allowed Papa, Alessi, and Lauria access to the NYPD property evidence storage room, where hundreds of kilograms of heroin lay seized from the now infamous French Connection bust, and from which the men would help themselves and replace missing heroin with flour and cornstarch to avoid detection. The substitution was discovered only when officers noticed insects eating all the bags of heroin. By that point, an estimated street value of approximately $70 million worth of heroin had already been taken. The racket was brought to light and arrests were made. Certain plotters received jail sentences, including Papa, who was later murdered in federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. Ultimately, the Guarini clan was exterminated during internecine wars within the French underworld. In 1971, Marcel Francisci was accused by the Bureau of Narcotics of being involved in the trafficking of heroin between Marseille and New York City. In January of 1982, Marcel Francisci was shot to death as he was entering his car in the parking lot of the building where he lived in Paris, France. Paul Carbone was born in the southern Corsican village of Propriano in 1894. He was a descendant of Napoleon's nurse, Ilaria Carboni. When he was a small child, his family moved to the impoverished Panier suburb of Marseille. He attended school there and was a hard-working student. His father died when he was only 12, and he had left school to support his mother and 2 younger brothers. He took any job that he could find to bring some type of income into the family. When Carbone was about 15, he moved to Alexandria, Egypt, where he started pimping. Much of the money he earned was sent back to his mother in France. His success had angered some rival pimps. In 1913, 3 pimps kidnapped Carbone and left him buried up to his neck in sand in the desert. He was rescued 3 days later by Francois Spirito, who had heard the 3 pimps boasting about what they had done in a bar. Carbone and Spirito struck up a lifelong friendship and business partnership. Spirito was also a pimp and part of a network that brought women from Paris to work in Egyptian brothels. Once recovered from his ordeal, Paul wanted to leave Egypt and persuaded Spirito to go to Shanghai with him. There, the pair got involved in opium smuggling. This lasted for about a year until the outbreak of World War I, when they returned to France to enlist. After being arrested for assault, Carbone was sent to the Batdaf unit. The Batdaf was a French military unit based in Algeria, consisting of men with criminal records or serious disciplinary problems. Whilst serving on the Western Front, Carbone met and became friends with Simon Sabiani, the future mayor of Marseille. Carbone was awarded a medal for his bravery during the conflict. After the war ended, Carbone and Spirito left for South America. In Peru, they started pimping and soon had 20 women working for them. The pair returned to Marseille in 1919, where they engaged in pimping and opium smuggling. The Carbone Spirito clan gained more and more influence in the Marseille underworld. By the late 1920s, they were involved in prostitution, white slavery, protection rackets, and various forms of trafficking. They were involved in drug trafficking, especially heroin and cocaine, and set up a laboratory in Bandol, near Marseille, to refine the raw opium from Egypt, Turkey, and Indochina into heroin, some of which was sent to Lucky Luciano in the United States. Owning a bar on Rue Pavilion, the Amical Bar, and the Bovo restaurant on Rue Bovo, the empire was run from these establishments. In Marseille alone, it had more than 25 brothels, mostly staffed by young Jewish women forced into prostitution. Carbone also had prostitution networks in Argentina, Egypt, and Spain. Although Pernod Ricard had been banned in France in 1914, he imported it from a distillery in Tarragona, Spain. After economic sanctions were imposed on Italy in 1936 because of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, Paul smuggled 34 tons of Parmesan cheese from Italy for Marseille's Italian population. During the Spanish Civil War, he sold arms to Francisco Franco's supporters. Carbone and Spirito were also active in Paris, where the prefect of police, Jean Chiappe, was a friend of Paul's. They initially set up an upmarket brothel in Montmartre. All brothels in Paris were then controlled by an obese Italian, Charles Codebo. Carbone and Spirito muscled in on his operation. With the money made in Paris, they opened brothels all over France and staffed them with women from Europe and South America. During the interwar period, the two allied with the mayor of Marseille, Simon Sabiani, and acted as his enforcers. In return, they received political protection. When Carbone and Spirito were arrested for the murder of the financial consultant Albert Prince in 1934, Sabiani came to their aid. After the 6th of February 1934 riots in Paris, Paul sent in his thugs to intimidate the dockers of Marseille, who were striking. Carbone died on the 16th of December 1943 in a train crash caused by the resistance sabotaging the train, blowing it up. The train had been targeted as it contained mostly German soldiers on leave. Paul had his legs crushed and one severed at the knee. He is reputed to have sung songs to cheer up the other victims while smoking his last cigarette before he died. However, his long-term mistress, Germaine, better known as Manouche, reported that he was taken to a local hospital where he died hours later.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
The Teamsters, founded in 1903, had 75,000 members in 1933. As a result of Hoffa's work with other union leaders to consolidate local union trucker groups into regional sections and then into a national body, which Hoffa ultimately completed over 2 decades, membership grew to 170,000 members by 1936, and 3 years later there were 420,000. The number grew steadily during World War II and in the post-war boom to top 1 million members by 1951. The Teamsters organized truck drivers and warehousemen throughout the Midwest and then nationwide. Hoffa played a major role in the union's skillful use of quickie strikes, secondary boycotts, and other means of leveraging union strength at one company, then to move to organize workers, and finally to win contract demands at other companies. That process, which took several years starting in the early 1930s, eventually brought the Teamsters to a position of being one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Trucking unions in that era were heavily influenced by, and in many cases controlled by, elements of organized crime. For Hoffa to unify and expand trucking unions, he had to make accommodations and arrangements with many gangsters, beginning in the Detroit area. Organized crime influence on the IBT increased as the union itself grew. Hoffa worked to defend the Teamsters from raids by other unions, including the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and he extended the Teamsters' influence in the Midwest from the late 1930s to the late 1940s. Although he never actually worked as a truck driver, he became president of Local 299 in December 1946. He then rose to lead the combined group of Detroit area locals shortly afterwards, and later advanced to become head of the Michigan Teamsters groups. Meanwhile, Hoffa obtained a deferment from military service in World War II by successfully making a case for his union leadership skills being of more value to the nation by keeping freight running smoothly to assist the war. At the 1952 IBT convention in Los Angeles, Hoffa was selected as national vice president by incoming President Dave Beck, the successor to Daniel J. Tobin, who had been president since 1907. Hoffa had quelled an internal revolt against Tobin by securing Central States regional support for Beck at the convention. In exchange, Beck made Hoffa a vice president. The IBT moved its headquarters from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C., taking over a large office building in the capital in 1955. IBT staff was also meanwhile enlarged, with many lawyers hired to assist with contract negotiations. Following his 1952 election as vice president, Hoffa began spending more of his time away from Detroit, either in Washington or traveling around the country for his expanded responsibilities. He took over the presidency of the Teamsters in 1957 at the convention in Miami Beach. Beck, his predecessor, had appeared before the John L. McClellan-led U.S. Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor or Management Field in March 1957, and took the Fifth Amendment 140 times in response to questions. Beck was under indictment when the IBT convention took place, and was convicted and imprisoned in a trial for fraud held in Seattle. The 1957 AFL-CIO convention, held in Atlantic City, New Jersey, voted nearly 5-1 to expel the IBT. Vice President Walter Reuther led the fight to oust the IBT on charges of Hoffa's corrupt leadership. President George Meany gave an emotional speech, advocating the removal of the IBT and stating that he could only agree to further affiliation of the Teamsters if they dismissed Hoffa as their president. Meany demanded a response from Hoffa, who replied through the press, "We'll see." At the time, the IBT was bringing in over $750,000 annually to the AFL-CIO. Following his re-election as president in 1961, he worked to expand the union. In 1964, he succeeded in bringing virtually all over-the-road truck drivers in North America under a single national master freight agreement, which may have been his biggest achievement in a lifetime of union activity. Hoffa then tried to bring airline workers and other transport employees into the union, with limited success. He was then facing immense personal strain, as he was under investigation, on trial, launching appeals of convictions, or imprisoned for virtually all of the 1960s. He was re-elected without opposition to a third 5-year term as president of the IBT, despite having been convicted of jury tampering and mail fraud in court verdicts that were stayed pending review on appeal. Delegates in Miami Beach also elected Frank Fitzsimmons as first vice president, who would become president if Hoffa has to serve a jail term. Jimmy had first faced major criminal investigations in 1957 as a result of the McClellan Committee. On March 14, 1957, Hoffa was arrested for allegedly trying to bribe an aide to the Select Committee. Hoffa denied the charges and was later acquitted, but the arrest triggered additional investigations and more arrests and indictments over the following weeks. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he appointed his younger brother Robert as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy had been frustrated in earlier attempts to convict Hoffa while working as counsel to the McClellan Subcommittee. As Attorney General from 1961, Kennedy pursued a strong attack on organized crime, and he carried on with a so-called Get Hoffa squad of prosecutors and investigators. In May 1963, Hoffa was indicted for jury tampering in Tennessee, charged with the attempted bribery of a grand juror during his 1962 conspiracy trial in Nashville. Hoffa was convicted on March 4, 1964, and subsequently sentenced to 8 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. While on bail during his appeal, Hoffa was convicted in a second trial held in Chicago on July 26, 1964, on 1 count of conspiracy and 3 counts of mail and wire fraud for improper use of the Teamsters Pension Fund, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Hoffa spent the next 3 years unsuccessfully appealing his 1964 convictions. Appeals filed by his chief counsel, St. Louis defense attorney Morris Schenker, reached the U.S. Supreme Court. He began serving his aggregate prison sentence of 13 years, 8 years for bribery, 5 years for fraud, on March 7, 1967, at the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. When Hoffa entered prison, Frank Fitzsimmons was named acting president of the Union, and Hoffa planned to run the Union from prison through Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons was a Hoffa loyalist, fellow Detroit resident, and a longtime member of Teamsters Local 299, who owed his own high position in large part to Hoffa's influence. Despite this, Fitzsimmons soon distanced himself from Hoffa's influence and control after 1967, to Hoffa's displeasure. Fitzsimmons also decentralized power somewhat within the IBT's administration structure, forgoing much of the control Hoffa took advantage of as Union president. While still in prison, Hoffa resigned as Teamsters president on June 19, 1971, and Fitzsimmons was elected Teamsters president on July 9, 1971. On December 23, 1971, less than 5 years into his 13-year sentence, Hoffa was released from prison when U.S. President Richard Nixon commuted it to time served. As a result of Hoffa's previous resignation, he was awarded a $1.75 million lump sum termination benefit by the Teamsters Retirement and Family Protection Plan. That type of pension settlement had never occurred with the Teamsters. The IBT then endorsed Nixon, a Republican, in his presidential re-election bid in 1972. In prior elections, the Union had normally supported Democratic nominees, but had endorsed Nixon in 1960. Hoffa regained his freedom, but the commutation from Nixon did not allow Hoffa to engage in the direct or indirect management of any labor organization until March 6, 1980. Hoffa contended that he had never agreed to that condition. Hoffa accused senior Nixon administration figures, including Attorney General John N. Mitchell and White House Special Counsel Charles Colson, of depriving him of his rights by imposing that condition. It was suspected that the condition had been imposed upon Hoffa because of requests from the Teamsters leadership, but that was denied by Fitzsimmons. By 1973, Hoffa was planning to seize the presidency of the Teamsters again. Hoffa sued to invalidate the restriction so that he could reassert his power over the Teamsters. John Dean, former White House counsel to Nixon, was among those called upon for depositions in 1974 court proceedings. Dean, who had become famous as a government witness in prosecutions arising from the Watergate scandal by mid-1973, had drafted the clause in 1971 at Nixon's request. Hoffa ultimately lost his court battle, since the court ruled that Nixon had acted within his powers by imposing the restriction, as it had been based on Hoffa's misconduct while he was serving as a Teamsters official. Hoffa faced immense resistance to his re-establishment of power from many corners, and had lost much of his earlier support even in the Detroit area. As a result, he intended to begin his comeback at the local level with Local 299 in Detroit, where he retained some influence. Hoffa's plans to regain the leadership of the Union were met with opposition from several members of the Mafia. One of them was Anthony Provenzano, who had been a Teamsters local leader in New Jersey and a national vice president of the Union during Hoffa's second term as its president. Provenzano had once been a friend of Hoffa's, but became an enemy after a reported feud when both were in federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, in the 1960s. In 1973 and 1974, Hoffa asked him for his support to regain his former position, but Provenzano refused and threatened Hoffa by reportedly saying he would kidnap and eviscerate his grandchildren. Provenzano was a captain in the New York City Genovese crime family. At least 2 of Provenzano's Union opponents had been murdered, and others who had spoken out against him had been assaulted. Other Mafia figures who became involved were Anthony Giacalone, an alleged kingpin in the Detroit Mafia, and his younger brother, Vito. The FBI believes that they were positioning themselves as mediators between Hoffa and Provenzano. The brothers had made 3 visits to Hoffa's home at Lake Orion, and 1 to the Guardian Building law offices. Their avowed purpose in meeting Hoffa was to set up a peace meeting between Provenzano and Hoffa. Hoffa's son, James, said, "Dad was pushing so hard to get back in office, I was increasingly afraid that the mob would do something about it." James was convinced that the peace meeting was a pretext to Giacalone's setting Dad up for a hit, since Hoffa had been increasingly uneasy each time the Giacalone brothers arrived. Hoffa disappeared on July 30th, 1975, after he had gone out to the meeting with Provenzano and Giacalone. The meeting was due to take place at 2 p.m. at the Matchless Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a Detroit suburb. The place was known to Hoffa, as it had been the site of the wedding reception of his son James. Hoffa wrote Giacalone's initials and the time and location of the meeting in his office calendar. Hoffa left his home at 1:15 p.m. Before heading to the restaurant, he stopped at the office of his close friend Louis Linteau, a former president of Teamsters Local 614, who now ran a limousine service. Linteau and Hoffa had been enemies early in their careers, but eventually became friends. When Hoffa left prison, Linteau had also become Hoffa's unofficial appointments secretary and arranged a dinner meeting between Hoffa and the Giacalone brothers on July 26th, in which they had informed him of the July 30th meeting. Linteau was out to lunch when Hoffa stopped by, and so Hoffa talked to some of the staff present and left a message for Linteau before he left for the Matchless Red Fox. Between 2:15 and 2:30 p.m., an annoyed Hoffa called his wife from a payphone on a post in front of Damen Hardware, directly behind the Matchless Red Fox, and complained that Giacalone had not shown up and that he had been stood up. His wife told him she had not heard from anyone. He told her he would be home at 4 p.m. to grill steaks for dinner. Several witnesses saw Hoffa standing by his car and pacing the restaurant's parking lot. 2 men saw Hoffa, recognized him, and stopped to chat with him briefly and to shake his hand. Hoffa also made a call to Linteau, in which he again complained that the men were late. Linteau gave the time as 3:30 p.m., but the FBI suspected that it was earlier, based on the timing of other phone calls from Linteau's office from around that time. The FBI estimates that Hoffa left the location without a struggle around 2:50 p.m. One witness reported seeing Hoffa in the back of a maroon Lincoln or Mercury car with 3 other people. At 7 a.m. the next day, Hoffa's wife called her son and daughter to say that their father had not come home. At 7:20 a.m., Linto went to the Machoose Red Fox and found Hoffa's unlocked car in the parking lot, but there was no sign of Hoffa, nor any indication of what had happened to him. Linto called the police, who later arrived at the scene. The Michigan State Police were brought in, and the FBI was alerted. At 6 p.m., Hoffa's son, James, filed a missing person report. The Hoffa family offered a $200,000 reward for any information about the disappearance. The primary piece of physical evidence obtained in the investigation was a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham, which belonged to Anthony Giacalone's son, Joseph. The car had been borrowed earlier that day by Charles Chucky O'Brien to deliver fish. O'Brien was Hoffa's foster son, although relations between them had soured in the years preceding Hoffa's disappearance. Investigators and Hoffa's family suspected that O'Brien had a role in Hoffa's disappearance. On August 21st, police dogs identified Hoffa's scent in the car. Giacalone and Provenzano, who denied having scheduled a meeting with Hoffa, were found not to have been near the restaurant that afternoon. According to Time, Provenzano was seen fraternizing with local union members in Hoboken, although Provenzano told investigators that he was playing cards with Stephen Andretta, Thomas Andretta's brother, in Union City, New Jersey, the day that Hoffa disappeared. Despite extensive surveillance and bugging, investigators found that the Mafia members who they thought were involved were generally unwilling to talk about Hoffa's disappearance, even in private. On December 4, 1975, a federal investigator in Detroit testified in court before presiding Judge James Paul Churchill that a witness had identified 3 New Jersey men as having participated in the abduction and murder of James R. Hoffa. The 3 men were close associates of Provenzano, Thomas Andretta, Salvatore Briguglio, and his brother Gabriel Briguglio. In October 1975, Michigan Attorney General Frank J. Kelly went to Waterford Township to supervise an unsuccessful expedition to locate and exhume Hoffa's remains. The search was triggered by a tip from an unnamed informer who said a group of mafiosi wanted Hoffa's body found. After years of investigation involving numerous law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, officials have not reached a definitive conclusion as to Hoffa's fate or who was involved. Hoffa's wife, Josephine, died on September 12, 1980, and is interred at Whitechapel Memorial Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. On December 9, 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead as of July 30, 1982, by Oakland County, Michigan probate judge Norman R. Barnard. In 1989, Kenneth Walton, the agent in charge of the FBI's Detroit office, told the Detroit News that he knew what had happened to Hoffa. "I'm comfortable I know who did it, but it's never going to be prosecuted because we would have to divulge informants, confidential sources." In 2001, the FBI matched DNA from Hoffa's hair, taken from a brush, with a strand of hair found in Joseph Giacalone's car. But it is possible that Hoffa had traveled in the car on a different day. On June 16, 2006, the Detroit Free Press published the entire Hoffex memo, a 56-page report prepared by the FBI for a January 1976 briefing on the case at the FBI headquarters in Washington. Although not claiming conclusively to establish the specifics of his disappearance, the memo records a belief that Hoffa was murdered at the behest of organized crime figures, who regarded his efforts to regain power in the Teamsters as a threat to their control of the union's pension fund. In the Hoffex memo, it was concluded, based on the evidence, that Chucky O'Brien, who was described by FBI investigators as a habitual liar, was driving Joseph Giacaloni's maroon 1975 Mercury on the day of the disappearance, and that Hoffa was seated in the right rear seat of the car. His body scent was located by police dogs, and a piece of his hair was recovered from the back seat. A pump-action 12-gauge shotgun was seized from the trunk of the car. You're watching the Everything Network. Alan Dorfman rose to prominence following World War II, and by the late 1950s was a close cohort of IBT President Jimmy Hoffa. Dorfman's rise coincided with enormous expansion in Teamsters' ranks, along with spectacular growth in the union's pension funds, which eventually came largely under Dorfman's administration. Alan's stepfather, Paul, was a close friend of Hoffa, and both Dorfmans were partners with Hoffa in a number of business ventures. Through mobster Santo Perrone, Jimmy Hoffa had met Paul Dorfman, who had done business with Perrone through the Chicago Scrap Handlers Union. Through Paul, Alan Dorfman entered into a working relationship with Joey Glimko, Paul DeLucia, and Sam Giancana. Through his stepfather, Alan met Hoffa and Local 337's president, Owen Burt Brennan. At Paul Dorfman's request, the Union Casualty and Life Insurance Company had set up a Chicago branch, owned by Paul Dorfman's wife, Alan's mother, Rosemary Rose, and his stepson, Alan. In early 1949, Hoffa set up the Michigan Conference of Teamsters Welfare Fund. In 1951, he persuaded two trustees of the fund, Frank Fitzsimmons and an employer trustee, to move the fund's business to the newly formed Chicago branch of Union Casualty Agency, despite the fact that Alan had no experience in the insurance business. When Union Casualty received fiduciary responsibility for the Michigan Conference Fund, Hoffa had already created a larger welfare fund, the Central States Health and Welfare Fund, which had also given its business to Union Casualty. The two fund accounts made up 90% of the branch company's contracts. During the first 8 years of fiduciary management by Union Casualty, the Dorfmans made more than $3 million in commissions and service fees. In one instance, Alan took $51,462 in premiums and simply deposited it in a special account that he maintained with his mother, with no complaints from the Teamsters. In 1953, a special investigatory committee established by the United States House of Representatives began inquiries into Hoffa's placement of Central States Health and Welfare Fund's monies with Dorfman's agency. Both Paul and Alan Dorfman refused to cooperate with the committee, which recommended that they be cited for contempt. In 1959, the McClellan Committee, a United States Senate group investigating potential crimes and improprieties in the U.S. labor movement, inquired again over the allegedly excessive fees paid by the Teamsters Central States Health and Welfare Fund to Dorfman's company. The committee also suspected that large cash withdrawals from the business were actually kickbacks to Jimmy Hoffa. Evidence presented to the committee showed, on the other hand, that while the Dorfmans had proposed a 17.5% fee to the fund, they had actually been paid only 7.6%, in line with prevailing rates in the industry over the previous 8 years. During the late 1950s, Dorfman became involved in approving loans for the Teamsters Central States, Southeast and Southwest Areas Pension Fund. Many of these loans were real estate loans to associates of high-ranking Teamster leaders or to organized crime-connected casinos in Las Vegas, Nevada. Among the loans he later made was a $160 million loan to Argent Corporation, which owned a group of casinos, including the Stardust Resort and Casino. The casinos at that time were infiltrated by organized crime, and profits were being heavily skimmed and paid to organized crime. A number of organized crime members were later convicted for their involvement in that skimming. Alan Dorfman was peripherally involved in the United States Department of Justice's prosecution of Hoffa for his involvement with a trucking company known as Test Fleet that he and Brennan had established in the 1950s in their wives' names and with the assistance of Commercial Carriers, Inc., a major trucking carrier whose employees the Teamsters represented. The United States Department of Justice brought criminal charges against Hoffa for accepting bribes from commercial carriers. The Test Fleet prosecution resulted in a hung jury in December 1962. However, Hoffa, Dorfman, and other Hoffa allies were charged with jury tampering that led to the hung jury. Dorfman was acquitted, but Hoffa was found guilty of this crime in 1964, and after a lengthy appeals process, went to prison in 1967. After Hoffa went to prison in 1967, Dorfman took effective control of the Central States Pension Fund. He was apparently well respected by the mob. A Chicago outfit mob boss was once heard discussing Dorfman with a subordinate saying, "Alan is not that type of guy, but the people that got a piece of him are that type of guy. Alan is meek and Alan is harmless, but the people behind him are not meek and they are not harmless." Dorfman was eventually indicted, along with several other Teamsters leaders, for embezzlement from the Union Pension Fund in 1970. He was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in federal prison. He was again investigated in 1973 on similar charges, related to payoffs given to have the Teamsters represent agricultural workers in California, in place of the United Farm Workers Union. In February 1974, Dorfman was indicted for fraud involving $1.4 million in loans made by the Teamsters Pension Fund to Gala Products American Pail Company, a plastics manufacturing company in Deming, New Mexico. Indicted along with Dorfman were Joseph Lombardo, aka Joey the Clown, Tony Spilotro, Irwin Weiner, and several others. Between 1959 and 1969, the Central States Pension Fund plan loans had gone unpaid. But in 1971, Irwin Weiner, a prominent bail bondsman, organized crime associate and friend of Jack Ruby, had purchased stock in the company and received another $1.4 million loan from the fund with a mere $7,000 deposit. The government's case collapsed after their main witness, Daniel Seifert, was murdered in September 1974, and the defendants were either acquitted or dropped from the indictment. Lombardo was convicted of Seifert's murder in 2007 as a result of Operation Family Secrets. By 1977, Dorfman had lost control of the Central States, Southeast and Southwest Areas Pension Fund due to the implementation of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 and subsequent increases in outside control of the fund. In 1979, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched Operation Pendorf for penetration of Alan Dorfman. The FBI installed hidden microphones in the office of Dorfman's insurance agency. As a result of information obtained from the wiretaps, a federal grand jury in Chicago indicted Dorfman and 4 others in May 1981. Dorfman was subsequently convicted in December 1982, along with Teamsters President Roy Lee Williams and Chicago outfit enforcer Joseph Lombardo, of conspiring to bribe Howard Cannon, the Democratic senator from Nevada, to oppose deregulation of the over-the-road trucking industry. 3 days before his sentencing, scheduled for January 23, 1983, Alan Dorfman was murdered in the parking lot outside the Lincolnwood Hyatt in Lincolnwood, Illinois. Described as a gangland-style execution, the murder was presumably intended to keep him from cooperating with authorities to avoid a possible 55-year prison sentence. He was with longtime friend Irwin Weiner, a known associate of many Chicago mob figures. Weiner was not injured in the incident. Dorfman attended the University of Illinois and taught physical education there. He and his wife Lynn had 4 children: James, Michael, David, and Kim. Born in Tampa, Florida, Frank Regano attended Stetson Law School and clerked for the Florida Supreme Court before admission to the Florida Bar in 1952 and beginning his trial practice in Tampa, Florida. In 1954, he was recruited by another attorney to represent several defendants arrested in Tampa for involvement in Santo Trafficante Jr.'s illegal bolita operations. He immediately befriended Trafficante, who thereafter admitted him into the inner circles of Florida's organized crime scene. He became a frequent visitor to Trafficante's Havana nightclubs. During one such visit, Trafficante told Regano that in 1957, he and others had set up then-Senator John F. Kennedy in a Havana hotel room with several prostitutes, and that Trafficante rued the day he had failed to preserve the moment in secret surveillance tapes that could have been used for bribery purposes. In 1959, after Fidel Castro overthrew the Fulgencio Batista regime in Cuba, Trafficante's casinos were closed down, and he was imprisoned by the new government. Frank worked on various attempts to free Trafficante, who was released in early 1960 and returned to the United States. By 1960, he was already known as a shrewd, up-and-coming criminal defense attorney who defended a wide range of clients. Thanks to a recommendation from Santo Trafficante, Regano was hired by Jimmy Hoffa to represent him on union corruption charges, thus beginning a long association with the infamous labor leader. He used his position with Hoffa to help place loans from the Teamsters pension funds in return for finder's fees. Liberus, the entertainer, was one such client for whom he attempted to get a Teamsters loan. Regano witnessed kickbacks of millions of dollars to Hoffa from the Teamsters pension fund. In 1963, again on Trafficante's recommendation, Regano began serving as attorney for Carlos Marcello, the head of the New Orleans crime family. In his book, Regano claimed that Hoffa, who was being hounded by United States Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy on corruption and jury tampering charges, asked him to convey a message to Trafficante and Marcello that an assassination of President Kennedy should be arranged. When Kennedy was shot and killed later that year, Regano wrote that Hoffa always assumed that Trafficante and Marcello had actually carried out such a plan. Trafficante did celebrate with Regano upon hearing word of Kennedy's assassination, but made no admission to Regano at that time that he was in any way involved. He did tell Regano later that the Central Intelligence Agency had once asked him for help in assassinating Castro in Cuba. In 1975, Regano was asked by Trafficante to convey an urgent message to Hoffa to be very careful and not take any chances. Within days, Hoffa disappeared under mysterious circumstances, never to be found. While representing Trafficante in connection with an arrest of several top mobsters in New York City, Regano was photographed having lunch with Trafficante, Marcello, and others, and was identified by Time magazine as a top Cosa Nostra hoodlum. He later sued Time for libel 16 and was represented by famed trial lawyer Melvin Belli. During the libel trial, he was called House Counsel for the Mob. He lost his suit. Belli had previously represented Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused killer of Kennedy, and Regano claimed that Trafficante warned him not to ask Belli any questions about Ruby. In connection with an incident made famous in the Martin Scorsese film Goodfellas, Regano helped represent 4 mobsters, including Jimmy the Gent, Burke, and Henry Hill, charged in 1972 with extortion in collecting a gambling debt in Tampa, Florida. Regano himself became the accused when he was charged with tax evasion in 1972. Although his conviction was reversed on appeal, he was later retried and convicted on related charges. As a result, he was suspended from the practice of law in 1976 and claims that Trafficante provided no support and abandoned him. In 1978, Regano testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was reinvestigating the John F. Kennedy assassination, and he denied any involvement in any JFK plots. In 1981, Frank was reinstated as an attorney by the Florida bar and eventually made amends with Trafficante, whom he then represented in 1986 in a racketeering case also made famous in the film Donnie Brasco. Trafficante, who was also represented by others, was acquitted of all charges. In 1990, he was again convicted of tax evasion. In 1993, he served 10 months in prison. On May 13, 1998, in Tampa, Frank Regano died in his sleep. He was survived by his second wife, former mistress, and their 2 children, and his first wife and their 3 children. It is claimed that on January 14, 1992, Frank told Jack Newfield of the New York Post that he relayed a request from Hoffa to the Tampa boss and the New Orleans boss, asking that the 2 Mafia bosses kill Kennedy. He repeated the claim 2 days later on ABC's Good Morning America, in Newfield's Frontline report entitled JFK, Hoffa and Mob broadcast in November 1992, and again in his 1994 autobiography Mob Lawyer. According to Frank, he met Hoffa at the Teamsters headquarters in Washington, then delivered the message to Trafficante and Carlos a few days later in a meeting at the Royal Orleans Hotel in New Orleans. He stated he was chosen by Hoffa because, as both Hoffa and Trafficante's lawyer, he could be assured of attorney-client privilege. He said that Jim Garrison served as a patsy for the New Orleans mob by disseminating theories that served to distract attention from Mafia figures who were involved in the plot. Although Regano believed he had received a few hints from both bosses that they had somehow been involved in the Kennedy assassination, it was not until just before he died in 1987 that Trafficante, according to Frank, made a direct confession to him. Frank wrote that on March 13, 1987, a dying Trafficante, he died 4 days later, asked to meet him in Tampa for a hurried meeting. While riding in Frank's car, Trafficante allegedly told Frank in Sicilian, "Carlos è fottuto. Non dovevamo ammazzare a Giovanni. Dovevamo ammazzare a Bobby," which Frank translated as, "Carlos screwed up. We shouldn't have killed John. We should have killed Bobby." Frank stated 3 witnesses could support his statement that he met Trafficante in Tampa. He refused to name them, adding, "One guy is afraid of retaliation. The other guys are 2 doctors who say they'll testify if they're summoned to court." Vincent Bugliosi has pointed out many flaws in Frank's claims, including the fact that Trafficante was most likely not in Tampa on the day in question, but was rather in North Miami Beach receiving dialysis treatments. Bugliosi argues that it is absurd to think that the Southern bosses would get involved in plotting to assassinate a president, particularly as nothing more than a supposed favor to Jimmy Hoffa. Bugliosi also points out that by allegedly conveying a message in 1963 to that effect, and by relating this confession from an alleged conspirator, Frank would himself be admitting to having been a part of a murder conspiracy. Shortly after the initial allegations, Jeffrey Hart compared Frank's account with that presented in Oliver Stone's recently released film JFK. According to Hart, Frank presented an earthy motive vastly more plausible than the movie theory. Hart quoted G. Robert Blakey as stating that he believed Frank and that his testimony would have strengthened the conclusions of the HSCA. Hart also quoted Frank Mankiewicz, Robert F. Kennedy's press secretary, as finding Frank's scenario as the most plausible assassination theory. When he was questioned by the Assassination Records Review Board, created in 1992 to re-examine JFK conspiracy theories after the release of Stone's film, he claimed to have contemporaneous notes of his conversations regarding the JFK plot. But when they were produced, he could not definitively state whether the notes were taken during the meetings with mob figures or later when he was working on his book. His notes were subjected to Secret Service tests to determine when they were actually prepared, but the results were inconclusive.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
You're watching the Everything Network. The Decalvalcante crime family, also known as the North Jersey crime family or North Jersey Mafia, is an Italian-American mafia organized crime family that operates mainly in northern New Jersey, particularly in Elizabeth, Newark, West New York, and the surrounding areas in North Jersey. The family is part of the nationwide criminal network known as the American Mafia. The Decalvalcante family operates on the opposite side of the Hudson River from the five families of New York, and maintains strong relations with the New York families, especially the Gambino crime family, as well as with the Philadelphia crime family and the Patriarca crime family of New England. The organization is considered by some to be the sixth family. The family's illicit activities include bookmaking, cement and construction violations, bootlegging, corruption, drug trafficking, extortion, fencing, fraud, hijacking, illegal gambling, loan sharking, money laundering, murder, peer thefts, pornography, prostitution, racketeering, and waste management violations. The origins of the Decalvalcante crime family can be traced back to Ribera, Sicily. The Commission did not recognize the Decalvalcantes as an autonomous crime family until the regime of Sam Decalvalcante. There were several bosses in North Jersey during the Prohibition era controlling transportation of alcohol and whiskey into New York City, and there were two mafia families based in New Jersey, the Newark family, headed by Gaspare D'Amico, and the Elizabeth family, headed by Stefano Badami. The New York City families had crews operating in New Jersey, the Masseria family's New Jersey faction, and the Reiner family's Jersey crew. There was also Abner Zwillman, a Jewish gangster operating in Newark, and the Philadelphia crime family operating in South Jersey. In 1935, Vincenzo Troia conspired to take over the Newark family and was murdered. D'Amico fled the United States in 1937 after a failed assassination attempt ordered by Joseph Prefaci. The Commission decided to divide up his territory among the five families and Badami's Elizabeth family. Stefano "Steve" Badami became the boss of the Elizabeth Newark family. His reign proved to be very disruptive, as members of the Newark and the Elizabeth factions began fighting for total control of New Jersey. Badami kept controlling the crew up to the 1950s, but he was murdered in 1955 in what appears to have been another power struggle between the two factions. Badami's underboss Filippo Amari began to run the illegal operation. Amari was recognized by US law enforcement as being heavily involved with extortion, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and narcotics activities in Newark and New York City. He was considered the new head of the New Jersey organization, but his reign proved to be very short, as there were multiple factions operating underneath who all conspired to take over. He relocated to Sicily and was replaced by Nicholas "Nick" Delmore. Delmore attended the infamous 1957 Appalachian Convention to represent the small New Jersey crime family with underbosses of Elizabeth and Newark, Frank Maggiore and Luis "Fat Lou" Larasso. Delmore kept running the organization until he became ill in the early 1960s. He died in 1964, and his nephew Simone Decalvalcante was installed as new boss of the officially recognized Decalvalcante crime family of North Jersey. After the retirement of family boss Nicholas Delmore between 1960 and 1964, Sam Decalvalcante replaced him. Sam acted as a liaison between the Mafia Commission and the Bonanno crime family after the beginning of the Bonanno War between the New York Five families. Under Sam's leadership, the New Jersey Mafia was transformed from a dysfunctional group of ever-warring factions into a cohesive and profitable crime family. He also doubled the number of made men in the family. He altered long-standing parts of the Mafia initiation ritual, abolishing the use of a gun, a knife, and a burning holy card when making new members of his organization, as he did not feel it was necessary, according to Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo. Despite this, he insisted there was no difference between the New Jersey Mafia and the five families on the other side of the Hudson River, and declared, "Cosa Nostra is Cosa Nostra." Sam oversaw illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering in New Jersey. He also had interests in lucrative pornography businesses in 2 states. Living in the Lawrenceville section of Lawrence Township, but working in Newark, he commanded an organization of around 60 made members, active in the tri-state area of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. The Decalvalcante crime family, as it came to be known, operated primarily in New Jersey, with interests in Connecticut, Troy, New York, and suburbs of New York City. His legal business front was the Kenilworth Plumbing and Heating Co., a plumbing supply store in Kenilworth. He and his wife Mary, née Abrams, 1912-1988, had 3 sons, Frank, Robert, and Carl. He later resided at 1015 Mercer Street in Princeton. Decalvalcante's ownership of a plumbing supplies store earned him the nickname Sam the Plumber, although his preferred sobriquet was the Count, which derived from his claims that he was the son of an Italian marquis. Another nickname of his was the Claw, as he had a reputation as a usurious loan shark. From 1961 to 1965, he was the subject of an FBI investigation known as the Goodfella tapes. The FBI used wiretaps and bugs at 4 locations in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, including the office of Decalvalcante's Kenilworth plumbing supply firm, to record conversations among Sam and his associates, which revealed detailed information on the day-to-day operations of the Mafia, and crimes including labor racketeering, corruption, loan sharking, and murder. The other locations where electronic surveillance was utilized were the Best Sales Co., a company in Newark controlled by Gerardo Catena, the Penn Jersey Vending Co. in Philadelphia, owned by Angelo Bruno, and a building known as The Barn. The investigation confirmed claims by cooperating witness Joe Valachi, provided crucial information on La Cosa Nostra, and revealed the existence of the Mafia Commission. One Justice Department official described the Decalvalcante papers as a report just as crucial as Valachi's disclosures. During these conversations, Sam repeatedly referred to himself as the father boss of his crime family. However, since no court order was issued for the wiretaps, none of the tapes could be used to indict him. Among the 8 murders discussed by him and his associates were the 1951 shooting of Willie Moretti in Cliffside Park and the 1962 hand grenade killing of Charles Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro in Youngstown, Ohio. In one conversation involving Sam and 3 others on February 23, 1963, Sam agreed with Angelo DiCarlo that the method of Moretti's murder was distasteful. Each of the 4 men were also critical of the method used to assassinate Cavallaro, as his 4-year-old son was also killed in the explosion. It was indicated that the use of hand grenades had since been forbidden by the Mafia. In another conversation in 1964, Sam and two others discussed methods of body disposal, with a car crusher, a garbage compactor, and a device capable of turning a human corpse into a meatball being mentioned. In 1965, he forbade the killing of an African-American construction worker who had assaulted the son of a mafioso with a shovel in a fight because the construction worker was a black Muslim, and Decalvalcante feared a war between the Nation of Islam and the Mafia. In addition to murder, the tapes revealed political corruption and links between mobsters and New Jersey public officials. Days before Thomas G. Dunn was elected mayor of Elizabeth, he visited him at his Kenilworth office on October 23, 1964. Dunn said to Decalvalcante, "If you have any way of getting to tell them to keep their lousy mouths shut, because this thing could cream me at the last minute. So if you can in some way get to these two guys, tell them to keep this thing out of the papers." Sam promised Dunn support in his mayoral campaign and asked, "Do you think we could get any city work?" To which Dunn laughed and replied, "Well, maybe." In a statement issued on June 10, 1969, Dunn claimed that at no point during the meeting had Decalvalcante asked him to do anything irregular or illegal, and that he had had no contact with Sam since. He also denied that Sam had any influence over his administration and claimed that he had not been aware of Decalvalcante's underworld associations. Other public officials implicated by the tapes included Cornelius Gallagher, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. In January 1965, Sam, along with Joseph Bayon Joe Ziccarelli, met with Emanuel Riggi, a reputed mafioso for whom the government was seeking deportation. At the meeting, Ziccarelli suggested that Riggi contact Congressman Gallagher, who, if the case ever got to Washington, would be in a position to get Riggi a favorable ruling. Gallagher had allegedly been connected with the Mafia since at least 1960. He denied that he was involved in Riggi's case and said, "Many kinds of people drop names of public figures, but no one is responsible for people dropping his name, whether the name droppers be reputable or disreputable individuals." Decalvalcante also discussed police bribery with DiCarlo. Two police chiefs named by Sam were John Elmeyer Jr. of Edison and Ralph C. Patrone from New Brunswick. In a February 4, 1965 discussion, Sam mentioned an illegal craps game which was being organized by a man known as Mickey. According to Sam, Mickey had an okay from Elmer to arrange the game, but still needed a contact possible on the county level. Mickey's county-level contact was alleged to have been arranged 3 previously by Dutch Meller, a former baseball player who operated taverns in Edison. Sam was recorded expressing some bitterness at Carlo Gambino's decision to appoint Joseph Colombo of the Colombo crime family to the commission, as he had hoped that his own family would be given the opportunity to join the commission as the 6th family. Speaking with his underboss Frank Maggiore, he said, "Colombo sits like a baby next to Gambino all the time. He'll do anything Carlo wants him to do," and later mused, "Sometimes, Frank, the more things you see, the more disillusioned you become. You know, honesty and honorability, those things." The bug planted in Sam's office also revealed affairs he was having with his secretary and other women. Maggiore was recorded telling him that he shouldn't run around because Gerardo Catina and Carlo Gambino don't. On June 13, 1969, after transcripts of the recordings were unsealed in court, a reporter from the New York Times visited the Decalvalcante home in Princeton Township. Mary Decalvalcante told the reporter, "If you don't mind, I'd rather not talk about it. I don't mind your asking, but I hope you appreciate my feelings." Sam is reputed to have masterminded a plot to extort thousands of dollars over a 6-week period in 1966 from the operators of an illegal dice game in the Philadelphia suburb of Traverse, Pennsylvania. On September 28, 1966, he allegedly sent 2 Brooklyn mafiosi, Daniel Annunziata and Gaetano Corky Vastola, to the game with the intention of feigning surprise at discovering that the dice were loaded, then staging a hold-up, demanding $20,000 and suggesting that he arbitrate the matter. 4 gamblers were robbed at gunpoint at the game, which was held at a Traverse motel. After 3 meetings, one held at Decalvalcante's company in Kenilworth, one at a diner in Lawrence Township, and other at a second motel in Traverse, a $12,000 settlement was arranged by Decalvalcante. He was eventually paid $3,800 by the robbery victims as the adjudicator. Alongside Philadelphia crime family boss Angelo Bruno, Decalvalcante appeared at Trenton Municipal Court on December 13, 1967, to answer to charges that they falsified applications for New Jersey driving licenses. On March 21, 1968, Decalvalcante, Vastola and Annunziata were arrested and indicted on charges of conspiring to violate federal extortion statutes following a 17-month racketeering investigation by 3 federal agencies. Sam was taken into custody at his Kenilworth plumbing and heating firm, where FBI agents seized 3 pistols and a shotgun from his office. On July 18, 1968, Sam was arrested by state and Union County officials as he left the Garden State Parkway in Kenilworth and charged under state statutes with illegally acquiring a .38 caliber pistol, which had been stolen during a burglary in Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania. The gun was among those seized by the FBI from his office. In an effort to discover if his client's offices in Kenilworth were bugged by authorities in relation to the Traverse extortion case, Decalvalcante's attorney, Sidney Chris Franzblau, requested a discovery motion argued on January 17, 1969, at which Deputy Attorney General William J. Brennan, Jr. was called to testify regarding any electronic surveillance that may have been utilized prior to his arrest. At the request of Franzblau, 2,300 transcript pages of taped conversations compiled by the FBI in the Decalvalcante papers were released to the public by David Satz, Jr., the United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey, on June 10, 1969. Franzblau requested the release in order to learn whether or not any information leading to the indictment against his client was obtained via illegal wiretapping. The recordings were inadmissible as evidence because they had been made illegally and covered a period between 1961 and 1965, prior to the 1966 extortion specified in the indictment. The government maintained that the illegal wiretap was not the source of information that led to the indictments of Decalvalcante, Vastola, and Annunziata. Sam was among 55 men and women indicted by a federal grand jury on December 16, 1969, in connection with a $20 million per year interstate numbers racket centered in Newark and Troy, New York. U.S. Attorney General John N. Mitchell described the operation as one of the largest gambling syndicates in the United States. He was formally charged with gambling offenses on January 2, 1970. The following day, he attended the wedding of his son, Carl Decalvalcante, a senior at the University of Vermont, to Cynthia Ann Snyder at St. Michael's Church in Trenton. Although he had initially barred news reporters from entering the ceremony, Decalvalcante relented and invited news people into the reception, saying, "You can drink what we drink, eat what we eat on me, but I don't want any of my guests embarrassed." Plainclothes policemen also photographed the wedding from outside. The lawyer Sidney Franzblau was responsible for inadvertently revealing organized crime secrets as the transcripts were made public because he had not asked that the disclosure be made only to the defense counsel. Decalvalcante subsequently dismissed Franz Blau as his defense attorney and replaced him with Raymond A. Brown. The beginning of Decalvalcante's extortion trial, which was initially scheduled to commence on February 16, 1970, was delayed when Brown notified the U.S. Attorney's Office that he would require time to familiarize himself with the case. In April 1970, he was being tried on the state weapons charges when he fell ill, forcing a halt to the trial. During Sam's extortion conspiracy trial in Newark, which consisted almost entirely of presentation from the prosecution, the government contended that he had masterminded the extortion plot. One of the victims of the Trevose holdup, Kenneth Martin, testified for the prosecution that he acted as an arbitrator for Annunziata and Vastola, that a $12,000 settlement was arranged by Decalvalcante, and that he was paid a fee for his role. The defense did not present any witnesses or evidence and relied instead on summations to the jury. Sam maintained throughout the trial that he had been framed and that he had only served as an impartial mediator in a gambling dispute. On September 24, 1970, following an 8-day trial, Sam was convicted by a federal jury in Newark of 3 counts of conspiracy to extort money from the operators of the Trevose dice game. It was the first criminal conviction of Decalvalcante, who was 57 years old at the time. He received the verdict impassively, according to the New York Times. Sam's co-defendants, Annunziata and Vastola, were convicted on 1 count each. His bail was set at $50,000 by U.S. District Judge Lawrence A. Whipple. Decalvalcante was sentenced on October 2, 1970, to the maximum penalty of 15 years in prison. Following his sentencing, Sam said, "What can I say? I don't know what happened. I tried to make things equal, but it's part of life. We take the bum deals with the good deals." In January 1971, Sam pleaded guilty to a charge of conspiring to operate the Newark Troy Numbers racket at a secret federal court hearing in Newark. In order to protect the rights of other defendants in the case, Sam's guilty plea was not made public until the following month, by which time the cases of the other defendants had been resolved. On March 10, 1971, Sam's 1970 extortion conspiracy conviction was reversed by the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Philadelphia after Judge Arlen M. Adams, acting on the opinion of a 3-judge panel, ruled that the case against him, Annunziata and Vastola, had been based on insufficient evidence. The ruling reversed 2 of the charges against Decalvalcante and ordered a new trial on the 3rd charge. The convictions of Annunziata and Vastola were also overturned. Sam subsequently requested immediate freedom from the Federal House of Detention in Manhattan, where he had been held since his sentencing in October 1970. The request was denied by Herbert J. Stern, attorney for New Jersey, who opposed releasing him because he was due to be sentenced in the gambling ring case. On March 15, 1971, Sam was sentenced at Newark Federal Court to 5 years imprisonment on the gambling conviction. He was also fined $10,000. He was re-indicted by a Union County grand jury on August 17, 1971, on the state charges of receiving the stolen pistol which was seized by the FBI in 1968. In January 1971, Sam pleaded guilty to a charge of conspiring to operate the Newark Troy Numbers racket at a secret federal court hearing in Newark. In order to protect the rights of other defendants in the case, Sam's guilty plea was not made public until the following month, by which time the cases of the other defendants had been resolved. On March 10, 1971, Sam's 1970 extortion conspiracy conviction was reversed by the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Philadelphia after Judge Arlen M. Adams, acting on the opinion of a three-judge panel, ruled that the case against him, Annunziata and Vastola, had been based on insufficient evidence. The ruling reversed two of the charges against Decalvalcantes and ordered a new trial on the third charge. The convictions of Annunziata and Vastola were also overturned. Sam subsequently requested immediate freedom from the Federal House of Detention in Manhattan, where he had been held since his sentencing in October 1970. The request was denied by Herbert J. Stern, the acting U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, who opposed releasing him because he was due to be sentenced in the gambling ring case. On March 15, 1971, Sam was sentenced at Newark Federal Court to 5 years imprisonment on the gambling conviction. He was also fined $10,000. He was re-indicted by a Union County grand jury on August 17, 1971, on the state charges of receiving the stolen pistol, which was seized by the FBI in 1968. John Riggi had been a business agent of the International Association of Laborers and Hod Carriers in New Jersey for years. He was promoted to the position of official boss of the Decalvalcante crime family, represented at meetings of the commission by the Genovese crime family. He reaped the enormous benefits of large labor and construction racketeering, loan sharking, illegal gambling activities, as well as a large legitimate income. He also had the family maintain their old traditions. John Riggi established a close friendship with new Gambino crime family boss, John Gotti. It was thought that Riggi still ran the family from prison, despite being very sick. His release date was in late 2012, but he was due to stand trial for ordering the shooting and murder of Staten Island, New York, resident Fred Weiss, a former journalist for the Staten Island Advance newspaper and real estate developer, in September 1989. The murder was allegedly a favor for John Gotti, who was worried that Weiss was a government informant and that this would put the Gambino and Decalvalcante families at high risk. Weiss and two mob partners had purchased a vacant property in Staten Island and started illegally dumping large amounts of dangerous medical waste there. When local authorities uncovered the scheme and started investigating Weiss, the two mob families became nervous. Gotti, who worried that Weiss might become a government witness in exchange for leniency, requested that the Decalvalcantes murder Weiss to protect them. On September 11, 1989, Vincent Palermo and Anthony Capo, as well as 12 other crime family associates, rode out in a convoy of 4 vehicles and drove to the New York condominium of Weiss's girlfriend. As Weiss left the building and got into his car, Palermo and a few other mobsters got out of their vehicle, approached Weiss and murdered him by shooting him in the face multiple times. Both of them would become made men as a result of this. In 1990, he was indicted on state and federal extortion and labor charges, pleading guilty in 1992 and sentenced to 12 years in prison at Butner in North Carolina. While in jail, John Riggi appointed a ruling panel to take control of the Decalvalcante crime family until his release. But the acting boss of the panel, Gaetano Corky Vastola, was arrested and jailed as well. John D'Amato was then appointed as acting boss. D'Amato's reign was short, as it soon became clear that he had been recruited by the Gambino crime family and had been conspiring to murder Vastola. Later in 1991, D'Amato got into an argument with his girlfriend, who was also involved with Anthony Rotondo. She told Rotondo that when she and D'Amato were out at clubs during the evenings, D'Amato would be swinging and have sex with other men. Reportedly, Rotondo became quite upset that someone within the family was taking part in homosexual acts and shared it with the current administration members, Giacomo Amari, the reputed underboss, and Stefano Vitabili, the powerful consigliere, who decided to have D'Amato murdered after informing the incarcerated Riggi. In January 1992, D'Amato was reported missing. His body has never been found. Vincent Palermo, Anthony Capo, and Anthony Rotondo would later testify about this murder against their former associates. In September 2003, John was sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison after pleading guilty to ordering the 1989 murder of Weiss. In 2006, Philip Abramo, Giuseppe Schiffoliti, and Stefano Vitabile were sentenced to life imprisonment for their involvement in the murder. John was released from the Federal Medical Center, Devons, on November 27, 2012. After his release, Riggi lived in a small house in Edison, New Jersey, with his nurse/doctor. He died there on August 3, 2015, at the age of 90. Toward the late 1990s, the ruling panel kept running the Decalvalcante crime family, with Giovanni Riggi still behind bars as the boss. The downfall of the family was precipitated in 1998, when an associate named Ralph Guarino became an FBI informant, in an effort to avoid a long prison sentence, in connection with taking part with two others in a heist of $1.6 million from the World Trade Center. Guarino spent 10 years undercover working for the FBI. He wore a listening device and recorded conversations that mobsters would have about criminal business. During Guarino's time as an informant, fellow mobster Joseph Masella was gunned down on the orders of Vincent Palermo. Using information provided by Guarino, U.S. law enforcement launched a large-scale arrest on December 2, 1999, of over 30 members and associates of the Decalvalcante crime family. Palermo realized they would likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars and decided to cooperate with the FBI in exchange for a lenient sentence. This resulted in the arrest of 12 more men less than a year later, decimating the crime family's hierarchy and putting it on the brink of extinction. Other top members, like Anthony Rotondo and Anthony Capo, also agreed to become government witnesses. In 2001, 20 mobsters were charged with racketeering, 7 murders, 14 murder conspiracies, attempted murder, extortion in the construction industry, and stock fraud. This was the 4th indictment of the family since 1999. Since then, several other top mobsters agreed to become government witnesses in exchange for being given lenient or no sentences at all. U.S. law enforcement even put Giovanni Riggi on trial, who was hoping to be released in 2003, and he was sentenced to 10 additional years in prison. Vincent Palermo was raised in a traditional Italian-American family in Brooklyn, New York. He was an in-law by marriage to Nicholas Delmore, the former head of the New Jersey crime family, whose nephew was Simone Decalvalcante, also a New Jersey mob boss whose daughter he married. He has 5 sisters, including Claire and Nancy, and 2 brothers. His father was an Italian immigrant who moved to New York when he was a teenager. Palermo came from a close-knit family and was said to have lived a harmonious lifestyle. He was an altar boy during adolescence. When Palermo was 16, his father died, which forced him to leave school and work 2 jobs to help support his family, as his mother was a bedridden asthmatic. In his earlier years, Palermo worked at a wholesale fish business in the Fulton Fish Market, where he earned the nickname Vinny Ocean. Palermo was very protective of children. He allegedly once stopped a man from beating his son and rescued a toddler relative who had accidentally fallen into a pool. Palermo was also reputedly a dedicated family man. He attended Sacred Heart Church in Island Park, New York, drove his daughters to brownie meetings, and reportedly watched Annie with one of his daughters regularly. Palermo also took in a troubled teenager named Richard, becoming his godfather. Palermo would allow his godson to stay at his home every weekend for a year, enabling the boy to study the Catholic sacraments in preparation for eventual baptism, communion, and confirmation. Palermo was divorced once and remarried. In the 1980s, he became indebted to a hospital, local doctors, and the federal government. The tax liens against his property were in his second wife's name, an Italian-American woman named Angela, totaling $68,000. At the time, he was paying a large mortgage on a waterfront mansion with a 100-foot pier located in Island Park, New York. He had 2 Social Security numbers and paid alimony to his first wife. He also supports his second family, 2 daughters, Danielle and Tara, and a son, Vincent Palermo Jr., along with Michael from his first marriage and Renee. His son, Michael, is a graduate of Fordham University and a licensed New York stockbroker. He was an investment banker with Goldman Sachs up until his father's indictment, when Vincent Palermo Jr. went into hiding. In the early 1960s, Palermo met and married the niece of crime boss Sam Decalvalcante of the Decalvalcante crime family. Decalvalcante took a liking to his nephew-in-law and began inviting him to visit his social club in Kenilworth, New Jersey. He worked at the fish markets in the early morning hours and hung out with mobsters on Sunday afternoons. Palermo cultivated relationships with other crime families, a lucrative loan sharking operation with one Gambino family Kappa regime, and bookmaking with another. He was also a close associate of the Genovese family. Palermo was known to say very little, speaking to only a very few close associates, and stayed away from mob-run social clubs. Until his racketeering indictment, he had only been arrested for the misdemeanor of stealing shrimp at the Fulton Fish Market. On September 11, 1989, Palermo, Anthony Capo, and James Jimmy Gallo murdered Staten Island resident Fred Weiss on orders from Decalvalcante boss Giovanni John the Eagle Riggi through capo Anthony Rotondo. Weiss was a former newspaper reporter for the Staten Island Advance and a real estate developer who had become associated with mobsters from both the Decalvalcante and Gambino families. Weiss and 2 mob partners had purchased a vacant property in Staten Island and started illegally dumping large amounts of dangerous medical waste there. Local authorities uncovered the scheme and started investigating Weiss, and the 2 mob families became nervous. Gambino boss John Gotti worried that Weiss might become a government witness in exchange for leniency and requested that the Decalvalcante family murder Weiss to protect them. Palermo, Capo, and Gallo drove to the New York condominium of Weiss's girlfriend. As Weiss left the building and climbed into his car, Palermo and Gallo shot him in the face. Palermo was appointed capo after the Weiss murder and given his own crew of soldiers. Riggi was sent to prison in 1989 and appointed Johnny Boy D'Amato as his acting boss. In January 1992, Anthony Capo participated in the murder of acting boss D'Amato. Earlier in 1991, D'Amato's girlfriend, retaliating against D'Amato over an argument, told Anthony Rotondo that D'Amato was an active bisexual. She described swinging encounters that D'Amato had in Manhattan sex clubs with both women and men. Rotondo shared this information with underboss Giacomo Amari and consigliere Stefano Vitabile. In 2003, Capo's Phil Abramo, Giuseppe Pino Schiffoliti, and the reputed consigliere Stefano Vitabile were charged in organizing various crimes, including the murder of D'Amato. Reputed men involved in the murder conspiracy, Palermo, Capo, and Rotondo, would later testify about this murder against their former associate. With Amari's death, there was no clear candidate to become the new acting boss. Riggi, still in prison, restructured the family, and created a ruling panel to run it in order to avoid a potential power struggle. Riggi appointed longtime members of the crime family to the panel: Vincent Palermo, Girolamo Jimmy Palermo, no relation to Vincent, and Charles Maggiore. However, Maggiore, furious that he wasn't appointed acting boss, decided to murder the two Palermos and take effective control of the Decalvalcante family. He asked Gallo to murder Vincent Palermo, but Gallo alerted Palermo about the plot. To protect himself, Palermo decided to murder Maggiore instead. Over the years, Maggiore had made many enemies by removing fellow mobsters from a labor union that he controlled and taking their money. Palermo was able to recruit Capo, Gallo, and Joseph Mazzella to find and kill Maggiore. However, on the one occasion when they were ready to kill Maggiore, they became nervous and decided not to do it. When they reported their failure back to Palermo, he decided that Maggiore didn't pose a threat after all and cancelled the murder contract. By the mid-90s, Palermo was the de facto boss of the Decalvalcante family, with Riggi reigning as boss in absentia from Jack.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Dragna grew up in East Harlem, in Manhattan, with his mother's cousin Antonio Rizzotto's family, also from Corleone. It is unknown when Dragna's father arrived in the United States. Jack stayed in New York for 10 years before returning to Sicily. As a young man, he joined the Italian army and later the Sicilian Mafia. In 1914, he returned to America. He appears to have had a relationship with Gaetano Reina, who eventually led his own crime family in Manhattan and the Bronx. That same year, Jack petitioned for naturalization as Charles Dragna and was a suspect in the murder of Jewish poultry dealer Barnett Bath. After the killing, Dragna fled to California. He was extradited to New York, but never went on trial. In 1915, Jack Dragna was arrested for Black Hand extortion of a Long Beach man and served 3 years in prison. He was arrested as Ignazio Rizzotto, leading to the assumption he was the brother of his criminal associate, Benigno Rizzotto, with whom he'd lived in New York City. During the Prohibition era, he and his brother Gaetano, now named Tom, ran extortion and illegal liquor distillation operations. In 1922, Jack married his second cousin, Francesca Rizzotto. After his prison stint, he worked closely with Joseph Ardazzone, a prominent mobster in Los Angeles. In 1931, Dragna succeeded Joseph Ardazzone as boss of the Los Angeles crime family. It was rumored that he was involved in Ardazzone's disappearance and presumed murder. The American Mafia wanted to make inroads in California and supported Dragna, as opposed to the Mustache Pete Ardazzone. His brother Tom became his consigliere. As boss, Dragna's chief source of income came from extorting local bookmakers for protection money, although he was also the main illegal gambling operator in the city. Other businesses, including running gambling ships, a heroin smuggling operation, and collecting extortion money. His close supporters included Girolamo Momo Adamo and John Roselli. Roselli had been a member of the Chicago outfit, but left for California and worked with Dragna in gambling. Roselli moved to Los Angeles in 1924, pleading guilty to bootlegging that same year. He began his California criminal career working for small-time bootleggers, becoming the top truck driver for Tony Cornero. Eventually, Roselli was promoted to working closely with the Cornero brothers to secure liquor imports into Southern California. He was especially important in bribing and securing the loyalty of Orange County officials opening up their ports for the gang's use. In 1926, Tony Cornero fled to Canada, escaping a 2-year bootlegging sentence. As a result of the gang's dissolution, Roselli went independent. He became further involved in several LA area vice rackets, especially prostitution and gambling. He first met Al Capone in 1927 on a trip to Chicago to attend the Jack Dempsey-Gene Tunney boxing match. Capone was holding a party that night at his headquarters, Metropole Hotel, where Johnny could briefly meet him and the Chicago outfit's inner circle. Roselli next met with Capone at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. In 1928, Capone invited Roselli to Chicago, offering him a role in his organization. Roselli was tasked with working with the Los Angeles crime family to monitor Capone's investments and facilitate cooperation between the LA and Chicago organizations. The LA branch of the Mafia was at the time under the leadership of Joseph Ardizzoni, and Roselli worked closely with Ardizzoni's underboss Jack Dragna. During this time, Roselli was involved with Los Angeles offshore gambling racket. He led the mob's hostile takeover of the gambling ship Monfalcone. Roselli's underworld activities sometimes had to be put on hold while he dealt with long bouts of tuberculosis. Johnny became close friends with film producer Brian Foy, who brought Roselli into the movie business as a producer with Foy's small production company, Eagle Lion Studios, where Roselli is credited on several early gangster movies as a producer. Roselli was also close friends with Columbia Pictures co-founder Harry Cohn. During the 1940s through the 1950s, Roselli's lawyer was Frank DeSimone. Secretly a mob member, DeSimone became the LA mob boss when Jack Dragna died in 1956. In 1942, Roselli was indicted on federal labor racketeering charges along with George Brown, former president of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees Union, and Willie Byoff, labor racketeer and former pimp. Later in 1942, Roselli enlisted in the United States Army, where he served for 3 years before receiving an undesirable discharge. It was while in the service that Roselli was convicted of the extortion scheme to extort money from Hollywood figures in 1943, serving a prison sentence until his release in 1947. In the mid-1950s, Roselli shifted his focus away from Hollywood and toward the fast-growing and highly profitable gambling mecca, Las Vegas, Nevada. By 1956, Roselli had become the Chicago and Los Angeles mob's chief representative in Las Vegas. His job was to ensure that the Chicago mob bosses received their share of the burgeoning casino revenues through skimming. However, according to the Los Angeles office of the FBI, Roselli was employed as a movie producer at Monogram Studios. Anthony Cornero Stralla, also known as the Admiral, and Tony the Hat, was a bootlegger and gambling entrepreneur in Southern California from the 1920s through the 1950s. During his varied career, he bootlegged liquor into Los Angeles, ran legal gambling ships in international waters, and legally operated casinos in Las Vegas, Nevada. Antonio Cornero was born in Lecchio Tanaro, province of Cuneo, in the Piedmont region of northern Italy. Stralla and his family immigrated to the United States after his father lost the farm in a card game and a fire destroyed their harvest. His father died a few years later, and his mother married Luigi Stralla, a former suitor from Italy. After their arrival in San Francisco, Cornero used the aliases Tony Cornero and Tony Stralla as he signed on to merchant ships bound for the Far East. In 1923, with Prohibition in effect, he became a rum runner. His clientele included many high-class customers and nightclubs. Using a shrimping business as a cover, Stralla started smuggling Canadian whiskey into Southern California with his small fleet of freighters. One of his ships, the SS Lily, could transport up to 4,000 cases of bootleg liquor in a single trip. He would unload the liquor beyond the 3-mile limit into his speedboats, which would bring it to the Southern California beaches. His fleet easily evaded the understaffed and ill-equipped U.S. Coast Guard. By the time Cornero Strala turned 25, he had become a millionaire. However, in 1926, the law caught up with him. Returning from Guaymas, Mexico, with an estimated 1,000 cases of rum, he was intercepted and arrested. Sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, he jokingly told reporters he'd only purchased the illegal cargo to keep 120 million people from being poisoned to death. While being transported by rail to prison, Cornero escaped from his guards and jumped off the train. He boarded a ship for Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and fled the US. Eventually, reaching Europe, he spent several years there in hiding. In 1929, he returned to Los Angeles and turned himself in. In 1931, shortly after his release from prison, Cornero established the Ken Tar Insulation Company. However, federal authorities soon discovered it was a cover for a large-scale bootlegging operation and raided it. Cornero then moved his operations to a location in Culver City, California. Soon he was producing up to 5,000 gallons of alcohol a day. Federal authorities raided the Culver City site, but found no evidence of bootlegging. Cornero was probably warned ahead of time. With the repeal of Prohibition, Cornero moved into gaming. In 1931, when gambling was legalized, he and his brothers Louis and Frank moved to Las Vegas and took an option to purchase a 30-acre piece of desert land outside the Las Vegas city limits. Cornero soon opened the Meadows Casino and Hotel, one of the first 7 licensed casinos in the Las Vegas area, with a hotel that opened soon after the casino. It is considered the earliest resorts in Vegas, 10 years before El Rancho Vegas, and 15 ahead of the Flamingo. However, Cornero's success soon brought unwanted attention. Charles Lucky Luciano, boss of the New York Luciano crime family and his associates, casino owner Meyer Lansky, demanded a percentage of Cornero's gaming profits. Cornero refused to be extorted, and the Meadows was eventually torched. Cornero sold his Las Vegas interests and moved back to Los Angeles. In 1936, Cornero decided to open a shipboard gaming operation off the Southern California coast. By sailing in international waters, Cornero hoped to legally run his gambling dens without interference from US authorities. Cornero purchased 2 large ships and converted them into luxury casinos at a cost of $300,000. He named the ships the SS Rex and the SS Tango. Cornero's premier cruise ship was the SS Rex, which could accommodate over 2,000 gamblers. It carried a crew of 350, including waiters and waitresses, gourmet chefs, a full orchestra, and a squad of gunmen. Its first-class dining room served French cuisine exclusively. The 2 ships were anchored outside the 3-mile limit, off Santa Monica and Long Beach. The wealthy of Los Angeles would take water taxis out to the ships to enjoy the gambling, shows, and restaurants. In October 1939, the Los Angeles Zoo was facing a financial crisis. Cornero offered the zoo a day's proceeds from the SS Rex. Considering that his ships were earning $300,000 a cruise, this was no idle gesture. Although zoo officials seriously considered the offer, pressure from state politicians forced them to decline it. The success of Cornero's floating casinos brought outrage from California officials. State Attorney General Earl Warren ordered a series of raids against his gambling ships. On May 4, 1946, after Warren became governor of California, he issued a public statement declaring his intentions to shut down gambling ships outside California waters. Warren said he intended to call the Navy and Coast Guard if necessary. During his address, Warren specifically denounced the newly built gambling ship owned by Admiral Tony Cornero. Warren stated, "It's an outrage that lumber should be used for such a gambling ship, when veterans can't get lumber with which to build their homes." Despite battles with authorities over the legality of their entering international waters, the state of California found a way to circumvent the 3-mile limit. The state refigured the starting point of the 3-mile limit off the coastline and determined the ships were indeed in California waters. Without wasting any time, police boarded several U.S. Coast Guard craft and sailed out to Cornero's ships to close them down and arrest Cornero. However, when the police reached the ships, Cornero would not let them board. Reportedly, Cornero turned the ship's fire hoses on the police when they attempted to board and declared they were committing piracy on the high seas. A standoff ensued for 8 days before Cornero finally surrendered. Cornero eventually closed his floating casinos. He later tried to reopen land-based illegal casinos in Los Angeles. However, he was thwarted by mobster Mickey Cohen. Instead, Cornero returned to Las Vegas. In Las Vegas, Cornero contacted his friend Orlando Silvagni, owner of the Apache Hotel. Cornero made a deal with Silvagni to lease the hotel casino and rename it the SS Rex after his former floating casino in California. The Las Vegas City Council, aware of Cornero's history with the Green Meadows Casino and his floating casinos, voted no on approving his gambling license. However, one councilman then changed his vote. The motion passed and Cornero got his license. However, in a later vote, the council revoked Cornero's gambling license, and he then closed the SS Rex. Cornero and his wife left Las Vegas and moved back to Beverly Hills, California. He made plans to invest in Baja California, in Mexico. On February 9, 1948, 2 Mexican men came to his home in Beverly Hills. When Cornero answered the door, one man gave Cornero a carton and said, "Here, Cornero, this is for you," and shot him 4 times in the stomach. Gravely wounded, Cornero underwent surgery that night and managed to survive the shooting. As soon as he recovered from his wounds, he returned to Vegas to build a new hotel and casino, the Stardust Resort and Casino. He bought a 40-acre piece of land on the Las Vegas Strip and filed an application with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to sell stock in the hotel corporation. When the stock was issued, Cornero bought 65,000 shares for 10 cents apiece, giving him majority control of the corporation at 51% of all stock. He then sold the remaining shares. Finally, he applied to the Nevada Gaming Commission for his gaming license and was turned down. The commission rejected his application because of an old bootlegging conviction and the trouble that he was having with the SEC. This rejection meant Cornero had invested his money in a half-built casino that he was not allowed to operate. Not to be stopped, Cornero came up with a new plan. He asked his friend Milton B. Farmer Page, another Las Vegas casino owner, to take over the project. Page agreed on the condition that he be able to run it. In 1955, Cornero made the first of several presentations seeking loans from Mo Dalitz, owner of the Desert Inn Hotel and Casino, and Dalitz's partner, New York mobster Meyer Lansky. Dalitz decided to initially loan Cornero $1.25 million. This loan was followed by a second and third loan, with Cornero using the unfinished Stardust Hotel as loan collateral. Loans with United Hotels were then nearly $4.3 million. Despite these cash infusions, Cornero ran out of money again as the hotel construction was finishing. On July 31, 1955, Cornero told an investors meeting in Las Vegas, "We need another $800,000 to stock the casino with cash and pay the liquor and food suppliers." Later that day, he was playing craps in the Desert Inn Casino. Suddenly, he fell to the floor and died. Rumors soon arose that someone had poisoned Cornero's drink. The rumors gained credence when Cornero's body was removed from the casino floor before anyone contacted the Clark County coroner or the Clark County Sheriff's Department. Cornero's drinking glass was taken and washed. Sheriff's deputies never had the chance to examine it. No autopsy was performed, and a coroner's jury in Los Angeles determined that he died of a heart attack. Tommy Lucchese of the Lucchese crime family was Dragner's main contact in New York. Dragner also controlled unions in the laundromat business and dress importing companies. As boss, Dragner often had to do business with representatives from the more powerful Cosa Nostra families in New York. When Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, an associate of the New York Luciano crime family, relocated to the West Coast during the late 1930s, he started his own rackets and formed an uneasy relationship with Dragner. Siegel brought in much more income for the Los Angeles family and generated a great deal of respect, which Dragner resented. Although many saw Siegel recruited gang boss Mickey Cohen as his chief lieutenant. Knowing Siegel's reputation for violence and that he was backed by Lansky and Luciano, who, from prison, sent word to Dragner that it was in his best interest to cooperate, Dragner accepted a subordinate role. On tax returns, Siegel claimed to earn his living through legal gambling at Santa Anita Park. He soon took over Los Angeles' numbers racket and used money from the Syndicate to help establish a drug trade route from Mexico and organized circuits with the Chicago outfit's wire services. By 1942, $250,000 to $300,000 a day was coming from the Syndicate's bookmaking wire operations. In 1946, because of problems with Siegel, the outfit took over the Continental Press and gave the percentage of the racing wire to Dragner, infuriating Siegel. Despite his complications with the wire services, Bugsy controlled several offshore casinos and a major prostitution ring. He also maintained relationships with politicians, businessmen, attorneys, accountants, and lobbyists who fronted for him. In Hollywood, Siegel was welcomed in the highest circles and befriended movie stars. He was known to associate with George Raft, Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, and Cary Grant, as well as studio executives Louis B. Mayer and Jack L. Warner. Actress Jean Harlow was a friend of Siegel and godmother to his daughter Millicent. Siegel bought real estate and threw lavish parties at his Beverly Hills home. He gained admiration from young celebrities, including Tony Curtis, Phil Silvers, and Frank Sinatra. Siegel had several relationships with prominent women, including socialite Countess Dorothy Di Frasso. The alliance with the Countess took Siegel to Italy in 1938, where he met Benito Mussolini, to whom Siegel tried to sell weapons. Siegel also met Nazi leaders Hermann Goering and Joseph Goebbels, to whom he took an instant dislike and later offered to kill. He only relented because of the Countess's anxious pleas. In Hollywood, Siegel worked with the Syndicate to form illegal rackets. He devised a plan of extorting movie studios. He would take over local trade unions, such as the Screen Extras Guild and the Los Angeles Teamsters, and stage strikes to force studios to pay him off so that unions would start working again. Siegel borrowed money from celebrities and did not pay them back, knowing that they would never ask him for the money. During his first year in Hollywood, he received more than $400,000 in loans from movie stars. Though many sources speak of a rivalry between them, Dragner and Siegel worked closely together, especially at organizing a racing wire service on the West Coast. In June 1947, the East Coast crime families murdered Siegel in Los Angeles due to his failure to properly manage the new Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. Mickey Cohen, who had been serving as Siegel's bodyguard, immediately took over Siegel's rackets and refused to accept Dragner's authority. Dragner ordered several murder attempts on Cohen, but he managed to survive them all. On February 14, 1950, the California Commission on Organized Crime singled out Jack Dragner as the head of a crime syndicate that controlled crime in Southern California. Soon after, several Los Angeles family members were arrested for the bombing of Mickey Cohen's home. Dragner fled the state to avoid questioning. He later surrendered to authorities and was questioned in the U.S. Senate for hearings, but denied all accusations against him. Cohen was also questioned in the hearings, and as a result was convicted of federal tax evasion and was forced to give up control of his rackets to the Los Angeles family. In 1953, the federal government ordered Dragner to be deported to Sicily. Back in 1932, he had violated immigration law by illegally entering the United States at the San Isidro border crossing in San Diego after a 3-day stay in Mexico. However, at the time of his death, he was still living in California, appealing against the deportation order. Jack Dragner was a very private boss who eschewed flashiness and attention. However, in the 1950s, the Los Angeles Police Department, under Chief William H. Parker, engaged in a campaign of harassment against organized crime figures. Dragner and his family were frequently arrested. When his wife Frances died in 1953, Dragner lost interest in running the Los Angeles family and instead focused on meeting new women. On one occasion, several members of the LAPD stationed themselves outside a trailer where him and a girlfriend were having sex. Using listening devices, officers gained enough evidence to arrest Dragner for engaging in lewd acts. On February 23, 1956, Jack Dragner died of a heart attack in Los Angeles. Dominic Brooklier joined Mickey Cohen's syndicate gambling operations in Southern California in the 1940s. During the Sunset Wars of the 1940s, Brooklier defected to rival Los Angeles mobster Jack Dragner's Los Angeles crime family. In 1947, Brooklier became a made man in the family. While working for Dragner, he unsuccessfully attempted to assassinate Cohen as he left a restaurant. From 1947 to 1953, he worked closely with Los Angeles family member Jimmy Fratianno in loan sharking. At some time in the late 1960s, he was promoted to captain in charge of a crew in Orange County, where he also lived. Sometime later, he legally changed his name to Dominic Brooklier. In early 1974, he replaced the deceased Joseph DiPolito as family underboss. On October 19, 1974, family boss Nick Licata died, and Brooklier was elected the new boss. Also in 1974, Brooklier and new underboss Samuel Ciortino were charged with racketeering under the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. He was specifically charged with extorting payments from a bookmaker in 1973. On April 19, 1975, the two men pleaded guilty to one count. In 1975, he ordered the killing of Los Angeles mobster Frank the Bomp Bompensiero. Brooklier had lost trust in Bompenciero's ability to keep secrets, and was angry at his criticisms of Brooklier's leadership. However, Bompensiero, a hitman himself and always a cautious man, proved to be an elusive target. In 1976, to allay Bompenciero's suspicions, Brooklier appointed him consigliere of the Los Angeles family. Unknown to Brooklier, Bompensiero was now working as a FBI informant. In March 1976, Bompensiero persuaded Brooklier to extort payments from Forex, a new company that produced pornography. However, Forex was actually created by the FBI as a sting operation. When the family discovered the sting, Fratianno immediately suspected Bompensiero of being an informant. On February 10, 1977, Los Angeles mobster Thomas Ricciardi finally fulfilled the murder contract by shooting Bompensiero in a phone booth near his apartment. While Brucklier was serving prison time in the mid-1970s, he appointed Jimmy Frasiano as his acting boss. Seeing a challenge to his authority, Brucklier placed a murder contract on Frasiano for what he felt was Frasiano's attempt at trying to usurp him. However, Fratiano had been informed by the FBI of the contract, and Fratiano agreed to turn state's evidence and testify against his Mafia associates in 1979. Fratiano now implicated Brucklier in the 1977 Bompensiero murder. In 1978, Brucklier was indicted on charges of racketeering, extortion, and murder. In November 1980, he was convicted of racketeering and extortion, but was acquitted of Bompensieri's murder. He was sentenced 2 months later to 5 years in prison. Brucklier's son, Anthony, was a criminal defense attorney. At the 1981 sentencing, before the U.S. District Judge, Anthony made a sobbing plea on his father's behalf. There are things in his past he shouldn't be proud of, and I'm not proud of. But he's always provided for his family. Whatever sentence he does, he'll be missed every day. On July 18, 1984, Dominic Brucklier died of a heart attack at the Tucson Federal Correctional Complex near Tucson, Arizona. Milano was born in 1925 in Cleveland, Ohio, to Anthony and Josephine Milano. His father was underboss of the Cleveland crime family from the 1930s until his retirement in 1976. Many members of the Milano family were involved in organized crime, including his uncle Frank Milano, who was boss of the Cleveland family and sat on the original commission from 1931 until he chose to flee the country to avoid tax evasion charges in 1935. His brothers were also involved in the Mafia, except for Carmen Milano, who chose to be a lawyer until eventually also becoming a mobster in the 1980s. He is also related through marriage to John Nardi, who was a Mafia associate who was killed for switching sides to the Irish mob during the Cleveland family's war with Danny Green. Milano moved with his family to Beverly Hills, California, in the late 1930s or early 1940s as a teenager. After graduating from high school, Milano became a part of Mickey Cohen's Syndicate and was involved in illegal gambling. After switching allegiance to the Los Angeles crime family, Milano became a made man in 1970. Soon after, he was promoted to captain in the family. His father, Anthony, while also being one of the main criminal powers in Cleveland, also had interests on the West Coast and was closely associated with the LA family. In March 1973, Milano and 6 others were charged with running a rigged gambling operation in Los Angeles that brought in up to $250,000 a month. Their trial was delayed when the key informant and witness, former Mafia associate John Dubsek, was shot and killed in Las Vegas. Although this scared other informants from testifying, Milano was still sentenced to 4 years in prison. Months later, Milano and 11 other men were indicted for conspiracy, racketeering and extortion against bookmakers, loan sharks and pornographers. Milano served 4 years for both indictments. In 1981, the top members of the Los Angeles crime family, including boss Dominic Brucklier, were sentenced to jail time on RICO charges. This left a power vacuum in the family and enabled Milano to step up and become acting boss. With Brucklier's death in 1984, Milano was made boss of the family and named his brother Carmen his underboss. Milano took charge of a depleted family and was successful in having illegal bookmakers pay tribute to his family, which was already heavily involved in extortion. On October 28, 1984, Milano was one of 20 people arrested as part of the LAPD's Operation Lightweight and accused of trying to take over a $1 million a week bookmaking operation. Milano was released due to lack of evidence. Milano and his brother, Carmen, were among 15 people arrested and charged on May 22, 1987, in an 18-count federal racketeering indictment following a 4-year investigation by the Department of Justice Organized Crime Task Force and the FBI. The indictment linked Milano with a conspiracy to murder Luis Tom Dragna over a statement that Dragna had given to the FBI, as well as the planned murder of John Patrick DiMattia. In March 1988, Milano pleaded guilty again to racketeering charges and received a 6-year prison sentence. He never acknowledged being a part of the Mafia. On April 4, 1991, Milano was paroled from prison. He was able to avoid any jail time from the Las Vegas indictments brought on by the murder of Herbert Blitzstein in 1997.